My name is Uthred. I am 18 years old, and I am the son of Lord Uthred of Verdonk. Uthred of Verdonk was both feared and respected as a warrior and trader. He was a hard man, a born sword carrier, but he was fair as well. He had over 10 boats and 150 warriors, as well as slaves and men at arms. He had been in battles all his life. He had made his name in the shield wall and in face-to-face combat with the Saxons, the Scots and the Franks. He had always told me that when I was 18 he would send me out to make a name for myself. He had taught me well. I had been schooled in sailing and fighting. He had his top warriors train with me, teach me their tips and tricks. I was educated on the way the shield wall was used, schooled on the use of the sword, the axe and the spear. My father had given me a ship and men enough to travel south to make my fortune. I had taken several of my boyhood friends. We had fought in several battles as warriors on my father's ships and were ready to make our way in the world. It was the Viking way, to send the eldest son into the world, to make his fortune, and to make him a man. We were 50 strong and armed to the teeth. The crew was made up of 30-foot soldiers that doubled up as rowers and 17 warriors, including myself. The other 3 men were Vagoff, the shipmaster, Gudver, his understudy, and Jarun, who doubled as a cabin boy that doubled as my servant and ship's cook. He was not the best cook and not the worst. We had been rowing for almost 10 days before we spotted a likely-looking place to stage our first attack. Our food and water supplies were waning and we needed to restock. Viking longboats are fast boats. They travel well over most types of sea, but they have little storage space. This battle would be my first as a leader. I had always fought under the leadership of a lord or shipmaster before. I was eager to show that I could lead my men into battle, eager to show I was man enough to prove my father right. My servant, Duran, helped me strap on my armour and both of my swords. I left my helmet until last, as it made my head so hot and sweaty in the summer sun. The oarsmen pulled harder as the ship started to approach the beach. From my fighting platform, at the prow of the ship, I could see activity in the village. They were getting ready to fight. That made me happy. It was ages since we had been treated to a good man-to-man fight. My ship had 50 men in it. 30 pulled on the oars, 20, including myself and the shipmaster, were ready to do battle. It would be our job to protect the ship while the rowers got ready to fight. It was impossible to row in chainmail. I was eager to get as near to the beach as possible. Many good warriors have lost their lives by dropping into deep water while wearing heavy armour. Plus, when you are waist-deep in water, it's harder to fight. I pulled on my helmet and unsheathed my longsword. We were only seconds from the beach. There was a shout of panic and several of my warriors at the front of the ship raised their shields. I heard the arrows before I saw them. They whizzed through the air. I called out to the rest of the men to raise their shields, and then I slipped my arm into the loops of my own shield and ran forward, helping to protect my men. The arrows thumped into our hide-covered shields and none found a home in human flesh. The ship bit into the sandbank and I made sure I was the first warrior over the side. The men appreciated a leader that acted like a true warrior. It gave them confidence. The Saxons ran straight at us, a huge mistake on their part. They were farmers and fishermen and were armed as such. The first attacker was armed with just a fishing spear. He thrust it at me and I parried it with my shield. My sword swung, but I was fainting. The fisherman danced and I thrust. The tip of my sword punctured his stomach. His scream rang in my ears. The next thrust of my sword took his breath away, quickly followed by his life. The water around me was now alive with my men. There were at least 15 of us on the shore now, and we moved forward. It was important for us to keep the villagers away from the longboat as my foot soldiers disembarked. Another man rushed toward me. He had a pitchfork. He thrust at my head and I dodged to the left. He thrust toward my torso and my shield took the impact. The barbs of the fork stuck in the hide and wood of the shield, and my sword chopped the head from the fork. The farmer tried to hit me with the broken shaft of his fork, as if it would hurt me. My sword's sharp tip pierced his throat and blood sprayed out into the sunlight. At the same time, I felt someone rush me from the right. I automatically thrust out my shield and heard a cry. The man had lost his footing and my sword hissed as it swung toward him. One blow to his stomach ended that man's life. His hands tried to grab the guts that spilt from the gash I left in his stomach, but his life and blood pulsed out of him. Another man ran at me, a billhook held high in his hands. As he swung it at me, I sidestepped him. My sword slashed out and drew blood from his arm. He screamed a curse at me and swung the billhook again. He swung it far too high and I dropped to my knees, feeling it swing over my head. My sword slid into his chest between two ribs and blood sprayed from his mouth as he tried to scream. I twisted the blade, opening up the wound. Then I withdrew my blade and slashed at his throat. He was dead before he hit the floor. I took a step back and watched as my crew dispatched the fishermen. The fishermen died on that beach. The beach that gave them food and life became their deathbed. We were warriors. We were Vikings that had fought in many battles. We were armed for war. My men had swords, axes and spears. We wore helmets, leg guards and chainmail. We battled toward the sand and I was, for one, more than happy to get my feet on dry, solid ground. They did not really know how to fight. If they had, they would not have charged at us. They would have waited for us to attack. A man weighed down with armor will soon tire running up a beach. They retreated, and that was good for me, and as the foot soldiers would have more time to prepare and meet us on the beach. I saw the fishermen congregating near one of the huts that lined the beach. I knew they would charge. They were leaderless and came at us slowly. It gave us time to prepare. Shield wall. Shield wall, I cried. Form the shield wall. Line up on me. My men knew what to do. They quickly formed the wall. Our shields slotted against each other, overlapping. I sheathed my long sword and unsheathed my short sword. A long sword is ideal for open fighting, but the short sword was better for close hand-to-hand fights, and especially in the shield wall. Other men sheathed their sword and axes, and soon we were all armed with short swords or spears. The Saxons ran at us, over 100 of them against 15 or so of us. I prayed to Odin, the god of war, that the rowers would meet us soon. We were outnumbered, and as good as my men were, I could not afford to lose any of them. My little warband was small enough as it was. "Brace yourselves, men!" I called out, and felt the warriors either side of me tense. As they got closer, my men started to hit the rims of their shields with the hilts of their swords, and they shouted curses and oaths. The din was amazing and was done to scare the enemy. They came at us, and as they came, I could see the fear on their faces as they got closer. They hit us face on, but our shields held strong. The shields were made to protect a warrior from sword and axe blows. These men had fishing spears, pitchforks and wooden staves. As the force of the attack rocked us back a step, my sword slid under the rim of my shield and I hacked, slashed and thrust into anything I could find. There was screaming from the other side of the shield wall, but we held strong. The second attack rocked us backwards again. The sand around our feet was red with blood. This time the Saxons held against us and we had to protect ourselves from the thrusts of their spears. I hacked and tried to bring death to their numbers. Other men stabbed their spears over the wall of shields. We spread death amongst those villagers. It was a bloodletting. I knew we were in a full-on battle when the blood started to spray. Our rowers did not let us down. They hit the villagers from the side and the pressure was released on our shield wall. We started to move forward. The Saxons ran. It was their second mistake that day. My warriors chased them, hacking and slashing. I was flanked by two of my finest warriors, Bergvid and Halfdan. We moved up the shore, dispatching anyone that stood in our way. It was a killing field and we revelled in the death. It was our job, it was our way of life. The Saxons that were left had started to bunch at the top of the beach, where the sand turned into solid ground. There were 10 or 12 men there, all big, all armed with pitchforks or spears. The three of us charged at them and with a few well-practiced strokes had put them all to the sword. When we had finished, I looked around at the little village. It was now a battleground. My men had finished their job well. They were after all well-practiced at the art of war. Some of the Saxons were moaning as they died in the sand. The rest of the village was deserted. I looked at my shield and noticed a chip in its face. I let it slip to the ground. I took my helmet off and wiped the sweat from my head with my arm. I dropped the shiny horned helmet to the floor and it was met by my chainmail. A brief look around told me that none of my men had suffered more than flesh wounds and those would heal. My shipmaster had an understudy and he was good at healing the wounded, as was Jarun. They were already tending to the injured. We looted the village, but the pickings were slim. We got food, beer and wine. The children and women had deserted the village, and even though I sent a few men into the nearby forest, they could not be found anywhere. We loaded all of the plunder into the hold of the ship, and some of the men pushed us backward into deeper water. It was our first attack on the coast of Britain, but would not be our last. That evening we pulled up on a small island off the south coast of Britain, and I posted guards to make sure our feast was not disturbed. Our campfires would attract attention, and I was not looking to be overrun in the middle of the night. I was not sure if the island was inhabited, but it was not worth running any risks. The men roasted some pigs and opened some casks of beer we had taken from the village. I called a council of war with my top 5 warriors. They were trusted men I had known for all my life. We were here to make our fortunes and to take from the Saxons all we could. Our lords, who already had made their homes in the north of England, would be eager to pay for slaves, and slaves were easy to come by. My father was a lord, and it was he who sent me out into the world to make my fortune. We planned to head down the coast and attack every village we came across. My men need more fights to hone their skills, and also we need to plunder some treasures. When the trip was over, I needed to pay off the crew, and to do that I need to find stuff to trade. Tools and weapons were always good items for trading. Obviously, gold and silver would be nice, but most of the villagers were poor. Anyone with any treasure would have money enough for their own guards. The following morning, we rowed out into a deeper channel and soon spied a fishing boat through the mist. There would be little to plunder, but the battle would be good for the men. My shipmaster, Vagoff, stopped the oarsmen long before the fishing vessel could hear them, and used the sails and the tide to bring us level with the boat. We were on them before they knew about it. Some of my men threw grappling hooks onto the masts. Hooking the barbed hooks over the spars made sure the boat could not drift away from us. There were 6 fishermen on the small boat. One of the men jumped into the water and tried to make his escape. The others tried to fight, but they stood no chance. I boarded the boat along with Halfdan, my oldest friend. We had known each other all of our 18 years. I dispatched 3 of the men with ease, and Halfdan made short work of the other 2. They were not fighters and had no weapons as such. There was little of value on the boat, apart from a hold full of fresh fish, but it would be useful in the future, so we towed it behind us as our sails led us south. As the wind propelled us over the choppy sea, I looked down over the crew. Most of the men were well known to me. A few were picked for their strength on the oars. Vagoff, the shipmaster, had been steering ships in my father's fleet for many years. He was by far the oldest of the crew. Vagoff had many talents. He was a fine shipmaster and warrior. He was a well-practiced healer and a great armourer. I was sure he was made my shipmaster, as much to protect me and guide me as he was to work for me. I was sure that I could learn a lot of the old warrior, so I always listened to his wise words. The winds were kind to us, and as evening approached, one of the men, stationed by the Dragon's Head at the front of the ship, cried out that land was near. We headed for the spit of land, and I sent 5 men over the side to check that we were not inviting an ambush. The men gave the all clear and we beached our ship. We made our camp that night and feasted on fish from the trawler's haul. We posted guards and I took my turn. I was eager to show that as well as their leader, I was also a warrior and fighter. The following morning I sent scouts out to see if there were any villages in the vicinity which might be worth raiding. They returned and brought good news. There was a village was less than a quarter of a mile away. We approached the village slowly. There was a good coverage of trees that hid us. The village was not guarded, and I knew we had the upper hand straight away. We broke cover and walked with purpose toward the nearest stand of huts. We were only yards from them when the alarm was sounded. The first men rushed us without thinking and died as a result. It was carnage. They knew little about fighting. Some had swords, others had farming tools, and my men played with them. They outnumbered us, but we did not worry about that. A warrior is worth a dozen farmers or fishermen in battle. The only man that put up any sort of fight was the village blacksmith. He was a huge man with arms that showed his trade. They were scarred with burns and thick with muscle. He swung a huge hammer. His first blow smashed the shield of one of my men and he hit the ground heavily. Halfdan rushed the smith, but was swatted like a fly by the huge hammer. That hammer looked dangerous as it was swung with ease by the big smith. My men backed away as the smith swung his hammer with menace. I sheathed my long sword and took out my short sword. I moved in toward the smith. He snarled at me and cursed in a language I did not understand, and I snarled back. We moved around each other. The rest of the fighting had stopped as we danced the dance of war. The smith moved in fast. The hammer whirled over my head, and I felt the hair on my head move as the smith just missed me. I thrust at his huge stomach. His leather apron deflected my blade. We parted and he moved in again. This time he aimed lower, and I let my shield take the blow. There was an almighty clang as the hammerhead hit the boss of the shield. My arm was deadened by the blow, and my shield dropped. He swung again, and I had to shift backwards to avoid his weapon. I slashed and caught his arm. The smith cried out with pain. His hammer was now held in just one hand, and I slashed at it with the sword. Blood dripped from the cut, and he dropped to one knee. His eyes looked at me with hatred, and I knew he was mine for the taking. He was still trying to swing the hammer at me. I moved backwards and then rushed at him. My shield hit him face on and knocked him over. At the same time, I slashed at his face. The tip of my blade pierced his cheek, and my second thrust took an eye. He was now down and still. I was eager to show that I was a warrior, and that mercy was not a word I understood. I stood over him and slashed the tip of my sword across his throat. The deed was done. His life dribbled out onto the ground as his body jerked the dance of the dead. I raised my sword and called out to Odin that I was sending a soul to him as a gift. My men were cheering and slapping each other's arms in celebration. The blacksmith was the only man that gave us trouble that day. The rest of the village rolled over, and we made short work of them. This village gave us much more plunder than the previous one. The smith had been producing weapons. There were casks of beer and wine. Food was plentiful. One house, the biggest, was raided, and several gold plates and a small number of coins were found. There were no women in the village that might make us money as slaves. We had them carry our loot back to the boats and then set them free. I wanted the world to know that I, Uthred, was on the warpath. Rumours produced fear. They produce panic. My father had taught me that. It was a great tactic. The treasure we had looted was stored in the hold of the fishing boat, and a crew of 5 men were left to guard our boats, and we headed off to see what else the area had to offer. We had marched for several hours when our scouts warned us of another village. I went forward with Halfdan and Bervid to take a look. The village was bigger than the others we had attacked so far. It had a fortified tower that was manned with 6 archers. That would make things difficult. There were at least 100 men wandering around. They seemed armed, and that worried me more than the archers. On the plus side, it seemed there was a market in town. That could mean there was more to loot to plunder. I was worried that the village was far too busy to attack, but many of the folks wandering around were unarmed. Vagoff and Halfdan were both eager to attack. I had to take their advice, so we went back into the forest to make our plan and to sharpen our weapons. It's good to be eager, but better to be prepared. As the men prepared for war, I called a council with 5 of my top warriors, including Vagoff. We discussed the best way to attack the village. It was Vagoff that came up with the final plan. The archers in the tower were the main concern. They would be able to pick us off from a distance and at will unless we sorted them out first. The plan was to send Duran into the village with some bread and cheese. He was young and did not look like a Viking warrior. We could dress him in rags to look like a beggar. He would climb the tower, and while the archers were distracted, we would attack. Once we had gotten in amongst the villagers, they would find it hard to use their deadly arrows. If there was one thing that we Vikings hated, it was archers they could kill from afar. Duran was called over and the plan was put to him. He agreed. He was a brave lad and was eager to get involved in the fight. The rest of us would split into 4 groups and attack from all 4 sides of the village at once. The plan was to create as much confusion and panic as possible. Each group of men was led by one of my trusted warriors. I told them all to wait until I gave the signal. We split up and made our way around the edge of the village. We walked deep enough into the forest so as not to be seen. Jarun came with my group. He was nervous and I tried to calm him down. He was very important to the plan. Jarun left us with his bag of food and we watched as he walked into the village. I could see him walking to the tower and watched as he climbed the ladder to the top. As he was around 10 feet from the platform, one of the archers called out to him. I could not hear the conversation from this distance, but they chatted for a few moments, and then Jarun kept climbing. I motioned my men to start to sneak forward. We needed to make as much ground as we could before the archers realized what was happening. I was worried about losing Jarun and hoped he would be clever enough to keep his head down once the battle started. Jarun was the son of my father's warriors, and I had been told to teach him well and to bring him back alive. I watched as the archers moved away from the rim of the tower. I gave them a few minutes to start their meal and then looked at one of my men. I nodded, and he blew on his battle horn. At the same time, we rushed from the undergrowth and into the people milling around the market stalls. I had my short sword in one hand and a dagger in the other. I was a warrior that day. I took life just like a child takes milk from his mother. I slashed at everything around me, not caring about age or sex. The noise in the village was tremendous. I knew the other warriors were doing their duty. People ran in many directions. No men were looking to fight us, they just ran for their lives. We kicked over market stalls and one of my men grabbed a burning torch and set fire to several of the huts. Folks ran from them and they were chopped down as they ran. We moved forward as a line and killed everything that stood in our way. At one point, our line was broken when a bull charged at us. The fires and the noise had spooked him. We managed to dodge him, others were not so fortunate. One of my men to the left of me fell to his knees and a glance told me an arrow had taken his life. I looked toward the tower and the archers were making ready to unleash another volley of arrows. I raised my shield and called for my men to do the same. There was a flurry of thuds as arrows bit into the limewood and bounced off without damaging us. I left my men to the fight and headed toward the tower, hidden from the archers' view by the huts. I had to remove the threat of the bowmen. It was essential to the attack. I turned toward the base of the tower and there were 3 guards at the foot of the ladder. As soon as I was in view, 2 of them charged at me. They were both armed with swords, Saxon short swords but no shields. The first man swung high at my head and I parried his blow. He fell to his left, obviously off balance. The second man ran with his sword out like a spear, and as he was inches from me, I sidestepped and chopped down. The sword dropped to the floor, as did his right hand. His screams were mortifying. The first man came at me. He chopped and thrust at me, but his sword did not find its target. I thrust and jabbed back at him, waiting to find his weak point. After a few slashes with his sword, it became obvious. When he had made a few attacks, his sword arm dropped and his chest was open to attack. I played the game, waited for the right time. As he tried to slash me, I used the heavy shield on my left arm to protect myself. Then he did it, his arm dropped and my sword arm thrust out. The tip of the blade only just pierced the skin, but it was enough to put him off his strike. He looked down at the blood oozing from his chest, and as he did so, my blade entered his stomach. Blood spilt from his lips as he cried out in pain. He fell to his knees, and at the same time, I rushed at the last man guarding the ladder. He was no more than a child, and when he saw me running at him, he bolted. I left him to run. It was more important to put the archers out of action. I looked up the ladder and saw no one looking down toward me, so I dropped my shield and started up the rungs one by one. I peeked over the edge of the tower. The archers were all facing into the village. Jarun was sitting on the floor, and he looked at me and winked. I was as quiet as possible as I climbed over the edge and dropped to the floor. The archers were far too busy to notice me. I looked around. There was a bench that they had been using. I motioned for Jarun to help. We grabbed one end each and without a sound ran at the archers. The surprise of being hit from behind caught them off guard. 3 of the archers toppled over the edge. One grabbed a dagger as he turned toward us and I slashed at his arm, cutting it. Blood sprayed from the wound and his cry filled the air. The other archer was trying to get his bow ready to fire. My blade split his stomach and his intestines fell from the wound. He was dead before he hit the floor. I turned to finish off the first man. Jarun was stood over him, an axe in his hand. and the man's head was nearly severed from his body. Blood covered the wooded floor of the tower. "Good boy," I shouted to him. His smile beamed forth. "Can you fire a bow, boy?" "Yes, lord," he said at the same time, grabbing a bow from one of the dead men. The string had broken, and I watched as he started to restring the weapon. I heard a commotion and looked down over the edge to see men working their way up the ladder. I picked up the body of a dead archer and dropped it down. The men took his body full on and they tumbled with it to the ground. The second dead body did even more damage. I turned and watched as Jarun aimed and fired at a group of Saxons that were getting ready to charge a group of men that were led by Bergvid. Jarun was good with a bow. He let arrow after arrow fly into the pack of men. I tried my hand with a bow, but I was nowhere near as quick or as accurate with the weapon as he was. He seemed to be a natural with the weapon. Looking down, the fight was in good progress. My men were now dispatching Saxons with ease, and the village was in total panic. I told Jarun I would be back for him and headed down the ladder. There were 2 injured Saxons at its base. I put them to the sword and then I clambered up and chopped at the ladder, making it useless. I did not want Jarun being surprised by the enemy. He was doing a good job with his bow and arrows. I ran toward the battle, moving faster now without a shield to weigh me down. I saw 3 men as they dashed around the corner of the hut. 2 carried spears, 1 a sword. The swordsman attacked first. His blade swished in the air and slashed down at me. He was quick, his arm was strong and his blade short. I waited, parrying his blows as he hacked at me. He backed off and charged. I met his charge with my shoulder. I was twice his weight, although he was taller than I was, and I knocked him off balance. As he tumbled, I flicked my blade at his leg and found flesh. That put him off, and as he looked at the wound, my blade found his guts. 3 quick thrusts, and he was no longer a threat. Blood oozed from the wound, and he died as he looked at the wound. As he hit the ground, the 2 spearmen rushed me. As they advanced, one fell to the ground. As his partner turned to look at him, I hacked and slashed at his spear. This took him by surprise, and he dropped his defense. My short sword took him in his throat and the fight was over. I looked at the spearman that had tumbled. An arrow was protruding from his chest. I shot a look at the tower and Jarun waved down at me. I moved back into the centre of the village. A boy ran at me and I swatted him away. I was a warrior but not a killer. The boy was less than 10 years old, and he was armed with no more than a wooden stick. It would have been cruel. The next man that ran at me was more serious about a fight. He had a broadsword and a small round shield. I backed away as his sword danced in the sunlight. He was well practiced with his weapon. I tried a few thrusts but backed away as he slashed at me. He was backing me up. A cursory glance told me there was a wooden hut only feet from my back. That was bad news. I waited for him to slash at my head and quickly dropped to the floor and rolled past his legs, slashing at his ankles as I went. He turned but turned slowly, and the tip of my short sword bit into the skin of his sword arm. He cursed me and yelled in anger. The 2 wounds slowed him down, but only just. He slashed at me, and I thrust. Once again I nicked him. He yelled again. Blood ran down his sword arm and I knew I was on top of the fight. I moved fast and slashed, before dancing this way and that, putting his aim off. I slashed, thrust, and jabbed at him. He was tiring and I knew it. I danced more, not worrying if my jabs found flesh, just eager to see him growing weary. He made one more attempt at attacking me, but his sword arm was too wounded to raise the weapon. As he made to strike out, I slashed and my blade caught his wrist, almost severing it. His broadsword hit the floor and his eyes looked straight into mine as my sword sliced into his stomach. He was dead before he hit the floor. There were some minor skirmishes in the village, but overall, the battle was over and we had won. The villagers that had not died that day had run from the village and the wounded were being helped on their way by the swords and spears of my men. I always thought it was better to die a quick death than a long, painful one. I met Halfdan in the centre of the village. He was sat on the wall of the village, well drinking in huge mouthfuls of water. He offered me the drinking cup as I approached, and I greedily drank. War gives you a great thirst, and the heat of the fires that roared around us made it even worse. "They put up a good fight, Uthred," he said, looking around the village. "That they did, Halfdan. Did we lose many men?" I replied, looking around. We lost just one man, there are some injuries, but that's all. He looked up at the tower. Jaroon did a good job. Yes, he did, I replied. I looked up and returned Jaroon's wave. I ordered 2 men to go and assist Jaroon's descent from the tower and told them to make sure there was a guard up there at all times. This villager was bountiful and we pilled our loot in the central square. There were gold, fabrics, tools and weapons. We soon had a tidy pile. On one side of the market there were slave cages, and these slaves became my slaves. They were mainly Franchen, obviously stolen in coastal raids. One was a dark-skinned girl of around 16 years old. She spat at my men as they walked past and swore in a language I was not familiar with. Several of the slaves were no more than mere boys, and they were all given jobs to do. They cooked us food and helped search for treasures. I was not eager to be in the village when the darkness of night came. The villagers that had fled would return, and I was sure would bring with them reinforcements. We used carts that had been used to bring goods to market to transport our plunder back to the boats. We left the village an hour before sunset, with 10 carts and over 24 slaves. We took no prisoners, as they were more trouble than they were worth. I stayed behind with 3 men, and we set fire to every hut in the village. The thatched roofs burning lit up the evening sky. I wanted to show the Saxons that we would show no mercy. When we caught up with the convoy, I removed my armour and weaponry, keeping just my trusty short sword and a dagger. The slaves were walking alongside the carts. As I walked past one, I heard her speak. "Where are you taking us?" she said. I turned to face her. It was the young Franchen girl had spat at us. "We have 2 boats moored on the coast," I replied. "You speak good English." "My father was a trader from Francia. We travelled the world," she replied, "until the Saxons killed him and kidnapped me." We talked as we walked, and she seemed nice enough. The walk to our boats took all night. We were attacked several times that evening. The villagers were obviously keen to get their revenge. My men proved their worth that night, and we fought off all the attacks with ease. Sunrise found us on the beach alongside our boats. We set up camp. Some of the men ate, some drank, and some slept. The villagers did not track us this far. I felt we were safe for the while, but that did not stop me posting guards. I did not want to be overrun. The guards would give us plenty of warning if the Saxons came toward us. The following morning, I walked around our camp to assess our losses and check on my men. 2 men dead and 4 injured, but only 1 seriously. The others would live to fight another day. The dead men were both good oarsmen, and I could replace them with 2 of the Franchen slave boys. They might not be as big or as strong, but a few weeks at the oars of my longboat would soon make men of them. Halfdan was already awake, and he and Vegoff were sorting out the treasure trove we had plundered. They had some of the slaves working away, loading the loot onto the fishing boat. The Franchens seemed happy to be camped with us, so much so the girl Lucille was helping Jaron with the cooking. He had pigs and lambs roasting over the huge campfires. Men were stirring around the camp, and they would need feeding. "Morning, Uthred," Halfdan said cheerily as I approached. "Good morning, my friends," I said. "Did we fare well?" "Well indeed, master," Vegoff said. He was marking down the loads on a tally sheet. I took the sheet from him and let out a low whistle. My father would be pleased. We were going to be sending back gold and silver coins, weapons, bundles of fabric, farming tools, all of which could be sold to make more money in the markets of the north. The fishing boat's hold was big, and it would only take a small crew to sail her back up to Northumbria. I discussed this with Vegoff as we ate breakfast. He suggested using Gudver, who was his understudy. He was a good sailor and could handle the boat, and more than that could be trusted. I intended to send 2 of my men back with him, and also Vegoff suggested talking to the slaves, to see if we could persuade some of them to work for us. It made sense, I needed more men, and if the Franchens were happy to work for us, then they would be more than welcome. After we had eaten, we gathered some food and approached the slaves. Halfdan and I handed out food to the slaves, and as they ate, I made them an offer. Some could speak English. For those that did not, Lucille translated. "Right, you have 3 choices. I need men to work on my fishing boat. I need men to row on my ship, and if that does not take your fancy, then I will set you free, I told them. Stick with me, and I will pay you, feed you, and clothe you. Slaves were of no use if you could not trust them. My father had taught me that. If they did not want to work, then there was no point trying to force them. One volunteer was worth 5 forced men. So that morning, some of the slaves left the camp and some were put to work. The fishing boat under the leadership of Uthred sailed north, and with it our treasures. I hoped that it would find its way to my father without being attacked. As I wandered around the camp, I noticed that Lucille was helping to tend to our wounded. She had decided to stay with us rather than make her way on her own. I was happy about that. She was easy on the eye with a cute arse. So, Lucille, will they recover? I asked as she tended to 2 of the most seriously wounded. Yes, I think so. They just need rest and quiet, she said with a smile. So you decided to stay with us? You could have walked out of the camp this morning, I said. You gave us food. You seem kind. And the Saxons were going to sell me to work in a whorehouse, she said with a sad look on her face. Better the devil you know than the devil you don't. And with that, she returned to tending to my men. We stayed in our camp for a week. The wounded needed time to recover, and I was not eager to run into a battle with so many men out of action. We took the time to repair and sharpen our weapons, Halfdan and Bergvid, as my senior warriors drilled the fit men, forming shield wall after shield wall. They drilled them at day and night when they were not prepared. I was preparing to move the following week and not before. It was the 7th night when they attacked. My sleep was disturbed by the yells of several men calling out, "Shield wall," from all over the camp. I grabbed my helmet, swords, and shield and ran toward the commotion. Getting dressed as I ran, I saw the shield wall was forming. I head for its centre, and Halfdan made room for me, and as we touched shields, he smiled a nervous smile. Any man that tells you he does not get scared in the face of a battle is mad or a liar. Men die in battle, and it only takes on slip or one lapse in concentration for that man to be you. It's a battle you need to keep your wits about you and never let your concentration levels drop. I have always thought a little fear kept me on edge and alert. "What's going on, Halfdan?" I had to yell to be heard over the din of the wall forming. "The guards saw a large force of men coming this way," he yelled back. "They said there were at least 100 men. I looked around. The wall was 30 men strong, and we were ready to do battle. We were on a spit of land that was narrow with deep gullies either side. It was ideal. They could not send that many men at us in one go. They came out of the darkness and ran at us. Their screams cut through the night air. The first wave hit us, and most died before they had time to fight. Our short swords and spears cut into them. They were obviously not used to fighting against a shield wall, and ours was well drilled. We held our shape and used the skills we had been taught since childhood. Viking boys are taught the rudimentary rules of the shield wall from an early age. They practice it with wooden staves for swords and are put through their paces day in, day out until it becomes second nature. If they attacked high, we defended low. If they attacked low, we defended high. When the first wave retreated, I called for my men to take a step backwards. It was a ploy my father had taught me. It meant that the second wave had to clamber over their comrades' dead bodies to get to us. That slowed them down and gave us an edge. We fought them off easily, though one of my men stumbled as a spear bit into his leg, and he was dragged from the wall and replaced as soon as possible. He was not mortally wounded, but he would have been a weak link in the shield wall, and a weak link can be exposed and broken. As the second wave retreated, I heard the thwap of bow beside my left ear. I looked around to see who was using the bow. It was Jeroen. He was shooting into the throng of men running away from us. I watched as he loaded another arrow and dispatched it toward the Saxons. A second thwap from my right side caught my attention. I swung around and saw that it was Lucille. I watched as she fired arrow after arrow into the men. I watched as several found their targets. Lucille was not as fast as Jeroen, but she was just as accurate. That night they attacked twice more, but they were no match for us. I decided to keep the men in the shield wall until daylight. The Saxons had gone, and when the sun rose, it was obvious why. We must have slaughtered over 50 of their men that day, and any leader worth his salt would have retreated. You can't lose that many men and not have it affect the morale of the warband. I smelt food coming from our campfire and let the men stand down. Vegolf, Halfdan and I searched the bodies. There was nothing of value to be taken, the odd decent weapon and a few shields, but no gold or silver. Most of their weapons were shoddy and they had no armour to speak of. We guarded the thin strip of land that led to our camp until some of my men had eaten. Then we went for our breakfast. Jeroen and Lucille fed the men and tended to a few wounds. We had survived well, but I was sure the Saxons would regroup and try again. This time their leader would bring more men and perhaps archers. Archers can make a difference again, a shield wall. Jeroen and Lucille went out and pulled the arrows from the wounded. I ordered the camp to be flattened, and within hours, we were pushing my longboat off the sandbank into deeper water. The oarsmen took their places and rowed us into the sea. As we moved away from the beach, several Saxons ran out onto the sand and jeered at us. They were brave from a distance. I ordered Jaron to use his bow. He fired a few shafts until we were too far away for him to be effective. Once into open water, Vegolf raised the sail and had the oarsmen pull in the long wooden oars. I never did see the point in working men when the wind and tide would move us along just as fast. We sailed all day, and as evening closed around us, Vegolf steered us into a small inlet for the night. We had made good distance, and I was sure the Saxon villagers would not have followed us. I allowed the men to make camp, light their fires, and soon the smell of cooking fish and meat filled the air. Jaron brought me food and beer. I was sitting talking to Vegolf and Halfdan. We all ate well that night. We had decided to head down the coast a little more and see if any small villages might offer up some treasure. A few guards watched over us all night, but there was little for them to report in the morning. The following morning, when we headed back into the sea, there was little wind, so the oarsmen were used to propel us. Our dragon's head cut through dense fog as we moved down the coast. The visibility was as near as damn it down to nothing, and we hugged the coastline. Vegolf was worried about heading out into open waters. The fogs that hung around the coasts of Britain could hide a boat for days on end. They made it hard to navigate. We carried such limited food and water on board the longboats that if we got becalmed at sea for a few days, things could be tough. We heard the battle before we saw it, the clash of steel on steel, men's death screams and war chants. At first I thought it was Saxon on Saxon, but soon Danish voices could be heard amongst the din. While we sailed, Vegolf was in charge, but now we were hearing battle, I took over. I ordered Jaron to fetch the arms and armour from the hold, and watched as he and Lucille worked tirelessly. Lucille worked as hard as any man. She made sure I got my equipment first. She helped me dress as I ordered the men to ship their oars. Danes were fighting some unknown enemy, and we might be able to help them. The tide was drawing us toward the battle. The thick fog was mixed with smoke now. You could taste it on your lips. We drew ever closer, and the noise of battle was unmistakable now. The fog parted, and what we saw shocked us. One dragon boat was beached, smoke billowed from it. Another rocked in the tide, and another was drifting away into the tide. Flames licked along the hull of the drifting boat, and it seemed crewless. The beach was a maelstrom of activity. There was a shield wall of Vikings, and it was being pummeled by wave after wave of Saxon warriors. The air above them was thick with arrows. The Saxon leader used his men well. They rushed the wall, and when they retreated, the archers let fly with their flying shafts of death. They were not giving the men in the shield wall any time to regroup. I admired the Saxon's lord. He was a good leader indeed. The Saxons looked like they outnumbered the Viking 10-1. I called for our sea anchor to be deployed to slow us down and called my men to face me. "Men, these are our blood brothers. We need to go to their aid," I cried out. "Will you fight for them this day?" There was a loud shout of agreement and a rattling of weapons against shields. "Good, then prepare yourselves," I called to them. I thought that if we split the Saxons into two attacking groups, we would have more of a chance. I called for Vegolf to steer the longboat toward the beach. We were over 200 yards from the fight, and it gave us room to make our shield wall before the Saxons saw us. As my men got ready to go over the side, I called Jarun to me. "Stay on the ship, keep Lucille with you and help Vegoff guard it, do you hear me, boy?" I yelled. He nodded his understanding. I then pointed at the group of Saxons archers that were standing by a copse of trees firing down onto the beach. They were making life uncomfortable for the Viking already fighting for their lives on the beach. "Do you think you can hit them from here?" I asked him. He looked over at them, judging the trajectory and distance. "Yes, Lord, I think I can," he said, still looking at them. "Once we have our wall formed, start letting your arrows fly," I ordered. I was the first one over the side. I left a crew of 5 on my ship. We rushed 2 through the surf and quickly formed our fighting shield wall. This was travelling wall. Its shape was that of an arrow. The side arms were there to help protect the men at the front of the wall. We edged forward, and it took longer for the Saxons to notice us than I thought it would. As soon as we were spotted, some of the archers rained arrows down on us. Our shields went up and took the brunt of their attack. Jarun started to fire arrows into the group, and that made them move backwards, but not before he had killed 4 or 5 men. We moved forward, and I saw a group of Saxons break from the main group and charge at us. They hit us hard and fast. They were good warriors, and they gave us a hard fight. We fought off the first wave and awaited the second wave. As we did so, I dropped out of the wall and pulled Halfdan and 4 other men with me. We huddled behind the men in the wall. We were hidden from the Saxons by the shields. As the second wave of Saxons hit the shield wall, I led my 5 men to a ditch that ran along the right-hand side of the battlefield. We had to put the archers to the sword or they would kill us as we attacked the foot soldiers. We ran as fast as we could with our weapons and armour. The ditch led off the battlefield and was deep enough to hide us from view. It led us into a copse of trees, and once we were well hidden by the trees, we clambered from the ditch. I led the men slowly towards the trees that the archers were closest to. When we were 100 yards away, I motioned for my men to stop. We took off our heavy armour, chainmail, and dropped our longswords to the floor. They would be of little use to us as it was important we moved fast and hit them hard. Our main weapon against the bunch of bowmen would be surprise. We ducked behind a dense natural hedge and edged closer. I did not want the archers to see us until the very last minute. I held up my hand to stop the men when we were around 5 yards from them. I wanted to time our attack perfectly. As soon as we attacked the archers, the foot soldiers would come to their rescue. The Saxons tried to look after their bowmen. The bowmen dropped their bows, and the foot soldiers closed in on the men protecting their boats. I charged, and my men ran with me. There were over 24 bowmen, and it was important that we killed as many as possible. I ran at a tight group, my short sword in my right hand, hacking and slashing. There were 8 men in the group, and 2 had died before they turned to face me. One man tried to raise his bow, and my fist smashed into his face. His nose cracked and crumpled under the blow. I was slashing wildly, trying to create as much panic as possible. My sword slashed and hacked at flesh. One young archer tried to hit me with his bow, but my short sword cut straight through his bow and into his guts. The blade stuck in him as he died and fell to his knees. I tried to pull it back, but it was jammed in him. I saw another man running at me. I looked around me for another weapon and saw a spear stuck in the ground. I let the sword go and grabbed the spear, just in time to deflect a blow to my head. The archer was holding a dagger, swinging it dangerously. I thrust the tip of the spear at his belly and he jumped to the left. I thrust again and he jumped again. He thrust and I parried his dagger away and quickly jabbed my spear into the soft flesh at the top of his arm. He screamed in pain and the dagger dropped to the floor. I jabbed again and blood sprayed from his arm. His attention turned to his arm, and when he looked away from me, I rammed the spear into his stomach. He was dead before he hit the floor. I turned quickly as another archer ran at me. I dropped to the floor and grabbed the dagger. As the archer ran at me, I slashed at his leg with the dagger. He was wounded enough to make him drop to the floor. I took a spear from the floor and its tip bit into his throat and his life poured out of him as he choked on his own blood. I looked around. Halfdan was fighting off 3 archers. As I went to his rescue, I ran full tilt at the men and crashed into them, driving them backwards. The spear jabbed and thrust at them. Halfdan made short work of one man, as I took the attention of the other 2. My spear bit into the upper thigh of one man, and then into his arm. He was big and strong. A lesser man would have dropped to the floor in pain. It took 4 more wounds before he dropped to his knees and Halfdan's sword half-severed his head. I looked around. My men stood gasping for breath, and the archers all lay around us, either dead or dying. It was a job well done. It would give the men on the beach some breathing space. I saw some of the Saxons on the beach running toward us. I grabbed a longbow and quiver of arrows. I was soon letting arrow after arrow fly. Some of my men followed my lead. I was not a great archer, but some of the arrows did find their targets. It was enough to put the Saxons off their stride. More Saxons ran away from the beach and toward us. Soon the arrows were not enough to keep them at bay. The men used shields to protect themselves and headed our way. "Right men, it's time to go," I cried. "Bring more arrows." We took the bows and as many quivers of arrows as we could and headed back into the forest. On the way, I yanked my short sword from the guts of the dead bowman. We headed along the ditch and ran back toward my men on the beach. They were still being attacked by over 100 Saxons foot soldiers. We dropped into a natural hollow and watched as the Saxons rushed the shield wall. They were starting to push my men backwards. "Right men, when the Saxons rush the wall, let fly," I ordered. We waited, and within seconds the Saxons rushed forward. We let our arrows fly and took out several Saxons. They dropped in the rear ranks. If we could even up the numbers, it would help the men left in the shield wall. I noticed that Jarun and Lucille were firing into the throng from the fighting platform on the ship. We shot arrow after arrow into the Saxons, until all of the quivers were empty. "Right men, we have no choice, we have to attack," I cried, "otherwise they will break our wall." I was sure it was madness, but they were my men and I needed to do something to help them. I could tell from my vantage point that the shield wall would soon be breached. We had no shields or armour, our charge was a silent one. We closed on their rearmost ranks and started slashing and hacking. There was death everywhere. Blood covered the floor, and the screams of pain and death filled the air. I was manic. I killed and wounded at will. The battle fever took over, and I was surrounded by my trusted men. We screamed as we hacked and slashed and stabbed and killed. As we killed, the men in the front ranks realised what was happening. They were being attacked at the wall, attacked from the rear, and from the boat arrows were raining down on them. I killed a boy. His Saxon sword snapped in two when he struck my well-made Viking short sword. He dropped a sturdy round shield to the floor and I picked it up. I used the shield and sword to good effect that day. I was Uthred, I was a warrior, and I was a bringer of death. I thrust my new shield into one man's face, and I heard a hollow sound as his face crumpled under the heavy metal boss. At the same time, my sword's tip ripped into another man's throat. I stepped backwards as a body fell before me. It was one of the men I had taken with me to attack the archers. His name, I was sure, was Vekvid. A huge war axe was stuck in his chest, and his last breath left his body in a howl of pain. The axeman was struggling to remove his axe from the chest cavity of my warrior. I slashed at his arms and then at his face. The anger I felt gave me a renewed strength, and I hacked until his body looked like a piece of meat. All around me, men were fighting, men were killing, men were dying. Suddenly 2 Saxons ran at me and I had to use the shield to protect myself from their spear tips. They kept thrusting and I kept the shield high, my sword ready to attack if the chance arose. They stepped back as if to make another assault and I made my charge. They were not expecting me to attack and I used my sword to take the tips from their spears. They were not as eager to attack with only wooden staves. One of them ran away heading toward the forest and his friend looked at him in amazement. My sword slid into his stomach and my shield smashed into his face. As I pulled my sword from his belly, I looked around at the battlefield. There were Saxons dead and dying all around. I looked toward the shield wall. They were now dropping their shields and many men dropped to the floor with exhaustion. As I walked over to my men, Bergvid walked toward me. Blood poured from a cut in his arm and bandages were wrapped around his thigh. "Bergvid, you and the men did well," I said as we shook hands. "Thank you, Lord. It was a hard battle, and we lost several good men this day," he said, looking back toward the place where the shield wall had stood its ground. I noticed that our longboat was now beached, and the crew were running up the beach with flasks of water. Lucille ran to me and gave me a flask, which I drank from before handing it to Bergvid. She handed another to Halfdan, who was sitting on his shield. He looked exhausted, and I knew how he felt. Jarun and some of the other men were tending to our wounded. I looked toward the other end of the beach. The Saxons were still pounding the shield wall that protected the last dragon boat still floating. I stood on a small hillock and called for silence. "Men, we have had to fight hard today," I shouted. "We have made a difference, and with one more push we can end this battle." I looked around. Over a third of my crew were either dead or wounded. "Our kinsmen are still trying to save the last dragon boat," I shouted. "If we attack now, the Saxons will be caught between us and it will be a killing field." They roared their approval. They howled like animals, and the sound of weapons being rattled against swords filled the air. "Are you with me?" I yelled at the top of my voice, and that was greeted by another roar from my men. I looked at Halfdan and he held out his arm to me. I pulled him to his feet and we led the men toward the Saxons. The battle was over almost as soon as it started. When the Saxons realized they were caught between us, they split into little groups. Some of them ran and some fought, and once their number was divided, we made short work of them. A huge group ran toward the forest and we let them go, too busy killing and too tired to run. The sand changed from bright yellow to a dirty pink as blood soaked into it. We took as many lives as we could that day. Soon the Vikings on the beach moved forward, and with the Saxons caught between us, we started to kill them. In all fairness, it was butchery. When it was over, I dropped to the floor and looked around me. The battleground was littered with dead bodies, and streams of blood trickled down to the sea to mix in with the surf. I shut my eyes and lay back. Every muscle in my body screamed out with pain. The beach was filled with the cries of the wounded and dying. The Vikings who had been stranded on the beach were led by a huge wizened old shipmaster called Uthred. He told me their story as we shared a flask of water. The 3 ships had been patrolling the area looking for likely-looking targets to raid. They had seen some merchants travelling with well-laden carts. When they had landed, the merchants had run for the trees. The Vikings had then chased them without sending out scouts first. The Saxon warriors had been hiding ready to ambush them. The Viking lord, Charhod the Elder, who had led the 3 ships, was too eager to get his hands on the plunder. He led all of his men into the battle. He died in the first attack. My father would have said he deserved to die for being so ill-prepared, but he was a cruel man in some ways. Arvid had been bringing up the rear and he saw what was happening. He led as many men as he could back to the ships, but it was too late. Most of the Danes were chopped down by a charge of horse-mounted Saxon warriors. They came at the Vikings from 3 sides and in greater numbers. Arvid told me it was carnage, a killing field. He had tried to get the ships out into deep water, but the Saxons fired burning arrows into the hulls. If there is one thing that always worried a Viking longboat crew was fire, a fire would outrun you. It was hard to fight a fire and the enemy at the same time. The Viking ships had carried nearly 300 men, and many of them had either died or been injured that day. He told us he was almost ready to give in when he had seen us land on the beach. As the only lord left alive on the beach, I took his men as mine and claimed the last remaining longboat as well. Arvid talked to the remaining Danes and they all agreed to adopt me as their master. Most men like to follow a master. It gives them purpose, I suppose. That evening I stood at the top of the beach and looked down over the battlefield. The men had worked hard. It is always difficult removing the dead from the battlefield. It is especially hard when they were your friends and kinfolk. The remaining 2 dragon boats were now moored and campfires were lighting the night sky. The smell of food and the noise of men chatting and laughing was indeed comforting. I had posted guards but also had lookouts in the trees. I looked down at where Halfdan and Vegoff were sitting. They were tucking into bread and cheese as some sort of fowl roasted on the fire. A battle can give a man a deep hunger, and it was important they were fed and watered in case the Saxon horde came back for more. I had very mixed emotions about that day. I had started the day as a lord with 1 dragon boat and 50 men. Over 20 of my men had died on the beach, and 10 more had been wounded. I had become master of another boat, and with that boat came its crew. I was now master of 100 men. The Saxons might come back at any time, and I was sure that if they did, they would be in greater numbers, and that worried me. A great warrior and great leader should know when to stand and fight, and know when the fight is foolish. I headed down to my friends. As I approached, Vagoff handed me a flask of wine, and I drank greedily. We feasted well that night. Arvid, the shipmaster, sat with us, and he asked us of our plans. I was not sure, but did not want him to know that. I think we should head south once the wounded men are well enough to travel, I told him. Jarun had taken some of the Franchans and was tending to our men. Over 25 men of my own crew had been wounded in the day's battle that still survived. I would decide over the next few days what was to be done. If the men were so wounded that they might not survive, then I was going to leave them. The longer we stayed in our current camp, the more chance we had of being attacked. I did not expect an attack that night, as both sides had suffered greatly, and none came. The morning was bright, and that was a good omen, as it was harder to attack when the enemy could see you coming. I made sure the men breakfasted well and told them to rest, the only duties being that of guarding the camp. I walked around the men chatting, seeing they were okay. I met up with Arvid, the shipmaster that had been the senior man left from the 3 ships. He was eager to talk. We discussed what should happen next. I decided that we needed a few days to see how many of the wounded might be strong enough to recover enough to come with us. I think we all feasted well that night. I know I slept like a baby under my ship cloak. When I awoke, the sun was already high in the sky, but not many men stirred. I looked down at myself as I stood and stretched. I was covered in the blood and grime of the previous battle. I had seen a low pool and waterfall when I was scouting around the camp the evening before. I wrapped my cloak around me and grabbed up my short sword. The pool was well hidden, and I was not worried about Saxons sneaking up on me. My guards would alert me before that happened. I stripped off my leather tunic and my trousers and dived into the pool. The water was warm, and I felt refreshed as it washed over me. I wallowed in the water. As I did so, I saw movement in the bushes that lined the pool. I was about to grab my sword when Lucille appeared before me. "Good morning, my lord," she greeted me with a smile. She knelt by the side of the pool and tested the warmth of the water. "Good morning, Lucille," I replied. "How did you sleep?" "Well, sir," she said. She stood as she said it, and I watched as she slid off her rough fabric dress. Underneath, she was as naked as a newborn babe. She tossed the dress onto the rocks and strode into the water. I could not take my eyes from her body. She had strong legs, large firm tits, and pussy with a covering of sparse brown hair. She swam towards me and I moved towards her. I took her in my arms, and she did not try to fight me. My mouth found hers and her arms pulled me tight against her. I kissed her mouth softly and she kissed me back. My hands reached around and stroked her firm buttocks as I ground my hard cock into her pubic mound. I was horny, and it seemed so was Lucille. I took her hand and led her to a patch of grass on the far side of the pool. I was about to lay her down on the ground when she slipped to her knees. I felt her lips on my stomach and my dick jumped and jerked at the closeness of her. It had been some time since my last fuck, and I had missed the touch of a woman. I watched as her lips slid closer and closer to my cock, which was now as hard as iron. Her lips slipped over its bulbous tip. She sucked my cock into her mouth and held it there, as her tongue swirled around its shaft. Her hands slid up and down my thighs before reaching behind me and gripping my buttocks. Lucille was a horny little minx, and she pulled my cock deeper into her mouth. My hands stroked her long, soft hair and shoulders as she sucked on me. Her lips were massaging my throbbing cock. I let her do all the work for a few minutes, but soon lust took over. I rammed my cock deep into her throat. I was so horny I wanted to unload my balls into her throat. I had never felt anything like as she sucked and pulled on my cock. I knew that I would not be able to hold on very long the way Lucille was devouring my swollen dick. Then suddenly I felt my cock exploded, sending a spout of thick, creamy cum into Lucille's willing mouth. I called a warning, but she did not hesitate. She just kept on sucking and swallowing my cum as it gushed out in waves. Finally, my cock stopped spurting, and Lucille lifted her head up off my cock. Was that what you wanted, Lord? She growled, my cum running down her chin. Some of it, I growled back at her. I knelt down beside her and pushed her down onto her back. Quickly pushing her legs apart, I guided my cock down to the wet gash between her legs. I entered her in one smooth stroke, making her gasp with pain or pleasure. What did I care? I needed to do this. I began to fuck her with long, deep strokes that buried my cock up to the hilt every time. I looked down at Lucille and she was stroking her own tits. I watched as she tweaked and twisted her own nipples. Her face was a mask of pleasure, and every time I thrust into her, a gush of air rushed from her lips. I lifted her legs up over my shoulders to get a better angle to thrust into her. I looked down at my dick sliding into Lucille's wet pussy. It was shiny with her juices, and I could see more juice dribbling out of her as I fucked her hard and deep. I leaned forward and kissed her hard on the mouth, and she responded by slipping her tongue into my mouth. We kissed passionately as I fucked her hot, tight pussy. Lucille was groaning and I was panting as I fucked her as hard as I could. I felt her hands pushing me away and she was wriggling away from me. I pulled my cock from her and watched as she got on her hands and knees. She wiggled that cute arse at me. I knelt behind her and taking my cock in my hand, I rubbed it up and down her pussy. Please, master. Fuck me like a beast, she growled. She was no innocent, this girl, I decided. I grabbed her hips and drove deep inside her. I was fucking her hard and deep, my stomach bouncing off her arse with a rhythmical thwacking sound. My hands reached beneath her and groped her firm titties. I was fucking her hard and fast, and Lucille was calling out my name as I drove into her. Every now and then, I pulled out of her cunt all the way and drove back into her. I loved the feeling as my cock entered her tight love tunnel. This she obviously enjoyed as well as she groaned and called for more. I was nearing my second orgasm and was driving wildly into Lucille. I heard her calling for her god, and with a loud, deep groan, she came hard and fast. I felt her juices dribbling down my cock and balls. It drove me to grind my cock deeper and harder. My cock jerked as I came inside her. I waited for my cock stop spewing its seed inside her, and then watched as my shrinking dick slipped from her pussy. I leaned back on and rested on my haunches. The sight of my seed and Lucille's juices dribbling from her pussy onto the floor was such a turn-on. Lucille leaned forward on her elbows. Her breathing was coming in gasps, and she was thanking me in low tones. We both stopped in that position for quite a while. After a few minutes, Lucille stood up and turned around. "Thank you, my lord, that was indeed wonderful," she said, kissing me on the lips. "I promised Jaron that I would help with the cooking." She dived into the cool lake water and swam to the far side. I watched as she got out on the far side and slipped her dress back on. She shot me a wave before heading off into the trees. I had a swim, letting the lake water wash the smell and the residue of our sex off my body. I guess the excursion of the sex had tired me out. I lay back and rested against a tree, letting the morning sun dry my body. It was the screaming that woke me. The sun was now high in the sky. I must have been sleeping for quite a while. I stood and grabbed my clothes. I ran around the lake, and as I did so, I could hear more screaming and the clash of steel on steel. As I stood on the edge of the trees and dressed as I watched the events unfolding beneath me, the foreshore was overrun with Saxons. There were hundreds of them, many of them on horseback. The dragon boats were pulling away from the beach. I saw men on the ships with spears trying to fend off some of the braver Saxon warriors who were trying to board the ships. Some of my men had bows and arrows, and they were firing their arrows into the Saxon battle lines. I knelt in the shadow of a copse of trees and prayed that Lucille had made it back to the boats before the Saxons had charged. The Saxons were mocking my men, calling them cowards. There must have been over 500 men on the beach, most of them dressed as warriors. I would have retreated as well, I told myself. Better to run and be able to fight another day. The ships pulled away faster now they had reached a deeper channel and the oars could bite deeper into the water. No matter how good an army, if you are outnumbered 5-1, then there is no way you can win. I lay down, keeping out of the line of sight. The Saxons were now dismounting and they were feasting on our food and ale. I lay and watched them for over 3 hours as they started to build a camp. I looked around myself. I had my cloak, a dagger, and my trusty short sword. I had no shield, no armour, and no money of any kind. It took only a few seconds for me to weigh up my options, and they were limited. The Saxons were looting the camp, and already some of them were drunk. They would be stopping here for a few days, I decided. The best thing for me to do was to head inland and try to hide from the Saxons for as long as possible. I headed back into the copse of trees. There was a small hill on the other side of the bay, and I would be able to track the course of the ship from its summit. I tried to be as quiet as possible. I was alone and with little weaponry. It would be foolish to try to fight. The trees gave me good coverage. I reached the base of the hill after a 2-hour hike. The climb to the top took another hour. There was a small lake at the top of the hill, and I drank from it, gulping the cool, clear water. I could see the 2 longboats in the bay. They were still. I hoped that that was because they were waiting to see any sign of me. I thought about lighting a fire and using the smoke to signal the boats, but that might draw the Saxons as well. I looked down, and on the far side of the hill, there was a little fishing village. A fishing village meant there would be boats, and that was my way of reaching my men. I headed down the slopes. I tried to hide away as much as possible, and several times. I hid in ditches or amongst the heather that covered the hillside as Saxons rode past. I waited until the late evening darkness before I sneaked into the village. There were no guards, and I walked down the main street without being challenged. The harbour was full of boats of all kinds. I dropped into a small rowing boat and untied its mooring rope. I used one oar to propel the boat out into the open sea. I did not want the splashing of the oars to waken the villagers while I was close enough to be shot at by archers. Once I was out of earshot, I dropped both oars into the rowlocks and pulled with all my might. I rowed out into the bay and let the darkness envelop me. The sea was calm, and I made a good distance. I stayed close to the coast, but far enough away to be safe from lookouts. The problem with being alone in a small boat is that you face backwards to row. When you get into a good rhythm, you do not stop to look forward. The fishing boats were upon me before I had time to do anything about it. One of the men on the fishing boat called out a greeting. It was obviously the name of the man that owned the boat. If I answered, I surely would be caught out. My accent was too obviously Danish. I turned quickly and glanced at the fishing boats. There were 3 of them, and I guessed that there would be at least 4 or 5 men on each vessel. I was in deep trouble. They outmanned me, and they would have spears and would be able to reach down into my boat from the high sides of the fishing boats. I dug the oars deeper into the water and turned my rowing boat in towards the coast. I knew it was a futile exercise, but it was better than being rammed and killed in the water. I could hear shouting behind me now, and I knew I had been rumbled. I rowed with all my might. Arrows were raining down around me. Luckily for me, the men on the boats were probably great fishermen but useless archers. The jolt as I hit the sand was like an axe hitting my shield. I dropped the oars and grabbed my sword. I jumped out of the boat onto the wet sand. The fishing boats were only minutes from the beach, and I ran for cover, eager to get as much ground between the fishermen and me. I ran for all I was worth, and it was not until I was almost upon them that I heard the voices in front of me. There were Saxon horsemen in the trees. I was not sure if they were looking for me or not, but I did not want to bump into them. The thunder in my ears told me horses were bearing down on me. The trees would give me some protection. I tried to blend in with the trees. From the sound of the hooves, there could be over a dozen horses in the trees, and those were not good odds. The only thing in my favour was the darkness. My woolen sea cloak was wrapped around me, and that helped. I dodged from tree to tree, trying to head away from the sound of the horses. I reached a gap in the trees. It was over 100 yards wide. It would be dangerous being out in the open, but I could hear the fishermen streaming through the trees behind me, and they would be upon me shortly. I waited for a cloud to shift in front of the moon and then dashed out into the clearing. I was halfway across when the 2 horsemen saw me. I heard the galloping of the horses and knew I was in trouble. If I ran, I would be cut down. There was no choice but to stand and fight. I whipped off my cloak and balled it around my arm to use as a shield. At the same time, I pulled my short sword from its scabbard. The first horseman was on me in a flash. His spear was extended and it missed me by an inch. I felt the swoosh of the air as his stallion galloped past. The second man was not moving as fast. As he approached me, I hit the ground and his spear blade cut through the air, where my head had been seconds earlier. I took a swipe at him but missed. The first man had turned and was now running me down. His spear arm was too extended and I chopped at it and felt my blade cut into his flesh. He screamed and that spooked the horse. I turned to see the first horseman was almost upon me. I hit the ground and rolled, trying not to be caught under its hooves. As soon as he was over me, he started to slow down. I stood up and ran at him, jumping up behind the rider. I had dropped my sword. My right hand reached around and held his waist, and my left hand went to his face, my fingers driving into his eyes. The feeling was terrible as his eyeballs popped under the pressure of my digits. His screaming was blood-curdling. He was struggling and we both fell from the horse. I felt the breath being forced from my lungs as I hit the floor, and the rider landed on top of me. I pushed him away and stood up. He was trying to get to his feet all the time, his hands were over his eyes. I kicked out at him, catching him under the chin. This knocked him backwards, and as he lay on the floor, I kicked him hard in the balls. He howled with pain and started to vomit. The other rider charged at me. His horse had froth on his nose and was panting like mad. I quickly looked around me for my sword. It was nowhere to be seen, but there was a spear, which I grabbed in both hands. As the rider reached me, I sidestepped and lunged the spear into his torso. It gripped into his flesh and I was knocked straight off my feet. The rider screamed and fell from his horse. He was injured and screaming as he held the spear that was sticking from his guts. There was a noise behind me and I turned to see what it was. The tree line was now alive with Saxons' foot soldiers. I guess the fishermen had alerted them to my presence. There were at least 60 of them, and they were all well armed. The Saxon horse riders were both on the ground, without an ounce of fight left in them. I reached for my short sword and ran to the nearest horse. I vaulted into the saddle and used my heels to spur it forward. The Saxons were firing their bows at me now, and arrows were raining down all around me. Several glanced off the horse, and one or two bounced off my leather tunic. Then I felt a blow to my shoulder. I looked, and the shaft of an arrow was deep in my flesh, blood oozing from its entry point. I tried to block out the pain and spurred the horse on faster. It was a fine stallion and soon put a fair distance between us and the Saxons' foot soldiers. I rode all night, and when sunrise broke on the horizon, I was near a small lake. I found a secluded spot and dismounted. I left the horse to drink from the cool waters. I was hungry and thirsty, but before I tended to my inner needs, I needed to get the arrow from my shoulder. The pain it generated every time I moved, my face was streaked with tears of pain. My arm was covered in blood. Luckily, the blood around the wound had congealed and that had stemmed the flow of blood. I washed the wound with the cold lake water and then cut some lengths of cloth from my undershirt. Digging the arrow out was painful. I used the tip of the dagger blade to cut the skin around the wound. I bit down on a willow branch as I grabbed the thick shaft and tugged it out. It took several pulls on the shaft before the arrowhead left the wound. Blood oozed from the entry wound. I felt the arrow drop from my hand. The world around me started to move in big circles. I tried to sit down. My head was now light and I felt hot. Then there was nothing but darkness. When I awoke, the sky was bright above me. I was hot and my mouth felt dry. I tried to sit up, but I felt hands on my chest pushing me down. I didn't have the strength to fight, so I lay back and the ground was soft, softer than I remember it. The darkness washed over me again. When I awoke again, I realised I was naked and that there were walls around me. I was in some sort of room, but from where I was, I could not tell exactly what sort. I tried to sit up, but could not. I managed to roll over slightly to give me a better view. I looked around and found I was in a bedroom. There was a door in the far wall. There were several other pieces of furniture, and on one wall was a rough wooden cross. I was on a low bed and there was a candle flickering to my left. I lay back and winced as the pain from my shoulder shot through my body. As the pain hit my head, the room went black. The water dribbling on my wound roused me from my slumber. I opened my eyes and looked at a rough wooden ceiling. I felt water on my wound again and looked around. 2 nuns were standing by the bed. One was holding a bowl of water, the other was using a cloth to wash the gash where the arrowhead had ripped into my flesh. They were both in habits and just their faces were showing. I could tell from their faces that they were both young and pretty. As I moved, the pain raked through my body and I cursed. One of the nuns looked at me and smiled. Her face was amazingly gorgeous. I lay back on the bed, biting my lip as the pain raced from the wound all around my body. They finished washing the wound and the prettiest nun dried it with another cloth. She was trying to be gentle, but the wound was still painful. I sniffed and there was no rancid smell that was always a good sign. A wound that smells is a wound that kills you. I guess I had drifted off to sleep again, and when the door closed, I opened my eyes. There was a jug of water on the table next to the bed and I drank from it. My shoulder was painful and my head was spinning. I lay back on the bed and soon sleep took over my body. Sleep is good for a wound, they say. The door opening woke me. It was the pretty nun entering the room. She had a tray in her hands and I watched as she sat it down on the bedside table. On the tray there was a jug of wine, plus a bowl of broth and some bread. She sat on the edge of the bed and smiled at me. "Are you hungry, sir?" she asked. Her voice was soft but sexy. "Yes, very," I replied, trying to sit up. "What do I call you?" "Sister Anne-Marie," she replied with a smile. I winced as I tried to move up the bed again. She helped me to sit up by putting more pillows behind my head. She smiled again and I smiled back at her. She handed me the bowl of broth and I ate it noisily. I felt like I had not eaten for weeks, and I mopped up the broth with the bread. As I was eating, Sister Anne-Marie sat and watched me intensely. She passed me a goblet of wine when I placed the empty soup bowl down. I gulped it down quickly. "So what do I call you?" she asked as she refilled the goblet. "My friends call me Uthred," I said in reply. "Well, Uthred, welcome to the convent of Our Blessed Lady," she said as wiped broth from my chin with a wet cloth. I sipped at the wine this time. It tasted of fruit. "How long was I asleep?" I asked. "We found you by the lake a week ago. We brought you here and tended to your wound," she said. "You had a fever, and your wound had bled quite a lot. How were you injured?" "I was in a fight and got shot with an arrow," I said, trying to judge how she took that news. "Are you a Dane?" she asked as I lay back on the bed. "Yes, I am Dane, a Viking," I replied. "Does that worry you?" "Not at all. God will protect me and keep me safe," she said as she gathered up the crockery. She left the room, leaving the door open. I could see out, onto a grassy courtyard. I saw other nuns going about their business. It was bright and sunny outside, and the fresh air made me feel tired, so I soon drifted off to sleep. When I awoke, the door was still open, but outside it was now dusk and it was a little colder. Sister Anne-Marie was sitting on a stool by the bed. She was doing some needlework. She must have sensed that I had woken as she looked up at me and smiled that sweet smile. Several candles lighted the room and they filled the room with a hazing smoke. Sister Anne-Marie stood up and looked at my shoulder. There was little pain coming from it now. I looked at the wound, it was not infected, which was good. It was well known that more men die of the infections that get into wounds days after battles than die on battlefields. "Your wound is healing well," she said, and she took a small jar from the bedside table. There was a brush sticking out of it. She painted a sweet, sticky balm onto the wound. It smelt of honey and herb I could not quite place. "What is that?" I asked. I was intrigued by its smell and the way it made my arm feel warm as she applied it. "Our Mother Superior makes it from an age-old recipe," she replied, and continued painting my skin. "It aids the healing of wounds," she said as she worked, "and it's worked wonders on your wound." When she had finished, she wished me good night and left the room, taking a candle with her to guide her way across the courtyard. I blew out the other candles and drifted off to sleep. The next few days seemed to pass by very slowly. Each day, Anne-Marie would wake me with a breakfast of fruit, bread and water. She would wash the wound, and then paint on the secret balm. She fed me 3 times a day, and we chatted as I ate. She told me of the workings of the convent, and of how she had found God when her parents had died. After a week, I was already feeling strong enough to make my way in the world. I had decided that in a couple of days I would continue my hunt for the boats and my men. I hoped that the Saxons had stopped their search for me, and that my men had not left the area. It was a long way back to Danish-ruled lands, and it would be perilous on my own. The plan was to ask Sister Anne-Marie for some food and then start the hunt. I really wanted to find a way to repay her and the other nuns for their kindness, but I had only the clothes I was found in and nothing of value to give to them. The sound that woke me came from above my head. Someone was walking on the roof of the building I was in. I guessed they had clambered over the convent wall and onto the roof of my current abode. I heard footsteps and then a thud as something or someone dropped to the floor outside my door. I guessed it was a man, and then there were more footsteps and more thuds. I was sure I heard the thuds as 4 men hit the floor. I slipped out of bed and moved to the door. There were some gaps in the wooden slats that made up the door, and I could see 4 men walking across the grass. They were all armed with spears. I looked around for something to use as a weapon but could see nothing. I waited until the men had slipped into a doorway on the far side of the courtyard and slowly slipped out of the door. I made my way across the courtyard as quietly as I could. I glanced into the doorway they had gone into. There was no sign of the men. The corridor was well lit, and there were doors on both sides. I was not sure which they may have gone into and what their goal was. If they were looking for me, I wondered if the nuns would give me up. If they were not looking for me, then what were they looking for? 4 against 1 was not favourable odds, and they were armed, and I had nothing to fight with. My predicament was not good. I decided to wait outside and see what was happening. I hid in some shadows and waited. I did not have to wait long. The first man came out carrying a box. It looked heavy, and he was struggling to carry it on his own. He was closely followed by 2 men. Each had a nun trussed up and tossed over his shoulder. I figured they were vagabonds just looking for some loot. I was wondering where the 4th man was when I heard a scream from within the convent. The 2 men carrying nuns placed them down on the ground and ran back in. The man that had carried the box out had his back to me, and I walked towards him. I tapped him on the shoulder, and as he turned, I smashed him on the chin with my right fist. The pain shot through my arm and shoulder as the wound reacted. My first punch only stunned him, and it took 3 more to fell the thick-skulled brute. His nose broke with my second punch. The vagabond dropped to his knees, and my own knee hit him hard in the nose. He was unconscious as I dragged him towards some bushes to hide the body. The odds were now looking a little better now. I walked back towards the box and the bodies of the nuns. Flipping open the lid of the box, I saw it was full of gold and silver coins. I untied the nuns and told them to go and wait in the room I had been in and to keep the door closed. When they were out of sight, I slipped back into the shadows and waited for the other men to come back out. When they came out, they had 4 nuns with them. They were leading them out using spears to prod and poke them to keep them moving. The first nun was older, and I guessed she was the Mother Superior. The other 3 were all younger, and I could see that Sister Anne-Marie was amongst them. I had to help her, as she had been so good to me. The vagabonds were looking around for the first 2 nuns and their friend. I could not hear what they were saying as I was too far away. It was obvious from their agitation they were worried about their friend. I was sure that they were not warriors, but if I rushed them, they may hurt the nuns. I decided to front up and see what happened. I stepped out of the shadows. "Good evening, gentlemen," I said, and they all turned to face me. "Who are you?" the leader asked. He was still looking around for his friend. "My name is Uthred, and who are you?" I replied, trying to put a tone of authority into my voice. "You're the Dane what Lord Smyness is looking for," he said with a snarl, and he started to move slowly towards me. "That may be true," I said with a smile. The other 2 men were also edging towards me. "There is a reward of 25 gold pieces on your head," he said, and started to pull a knife from his belt. "25 gold pieces for your body, dead or alive," he shouted. He charged, and his spear was in one hand and the dagger was in the other. As he got near, I sidestepped and rammed my fist into his face. He stumbled, and as he did so, I kicked out my foot, just catching the side of his head. He grunted, but was soon on his feet. He had dropped the spear, but he slashed at me with his knife. It cut the air in front of my face, but as his arm carried on with the slash, I grabbed his wrist and twisted. I heard the nuns screaming and glanced over, but they were just shocked by the violence, I guessed. At the same time, I punched hard into his face. His nose crunched under the impact. He dropped to his knees and then fell face first onto the courtyard floor. I swung a kick at his head and heard a sickening crack as his head jolted backwards. I heard a noise behind me and saw one of the other men running towards me. I looked around and saw a spear on the ground to the right of me. I dropped to the floor and rolled, picking up the spear and getting to my feet in almost one movement. The vagabond jabbed at me with his own spear, and I used mine to parry the blow. His next thrust was aimed towards my stomach, and I knocked that blow away as well. He fell forward, and I thrust, catching the flesh at the top of his arm. He dropped to his knees and grabbed at the wound. There was blood flowing from the wound as he stood up. He looked at it, growled and ran at me. His spear was held high and I dropped low. The tip of my spear bit into his soft belly. He stopped in his tracks and grabbed at the lesion. I turned to see that the last man was running away. He had seen 2 of his friends being bettered and obviously did not want to get involved in the fight. I could not let him get away and raise the alarm to the other Saxons that I was hiding in the convent. I grabbed a spear and aimed, releasing it with all the power I could muster. The Saxon dropped to the floor as the force of the blow took him off his feet. He was not dead. I could see he was moving. I ran to where he had dropped and grabbed him, holding him down. There was a knife in a scabbard in his belt. I took it, and with my hand clamped over his mouth, I slit his throat. I held him, keeping him quiet until the last of his death throes had left his body. Once he was dead, I checked each of the other men in turn. The leader was already dead. The other 2 I sent to their gods by slitting their throats with the dagger. The nuns watched with shocked looks on their faces as I went workmanlike about my business. It was a warrior's job to fight, and I was a warrior. I had done what needed to be done, and now I sat on a small bench and tried to catch my breath. Sister Anne-Marie walked towards me. The others seemed scared of me, but she seemed at ease with my actions. "Are you unharmed, Uthred?" she asked. There was a tremble in her voice. "I am well, Sister Anne-Marie. Are you and the other nuns unharmed?" I asked. "We are all well," she replied. "They were going to rape and rob us. Thank you for saving us." "It's justice. They would have killed me." "I had to defend myself," I said, trying to judge how she was feeling about my actions. "But more importantly, I had to save you and the others." "I understand." She looked at the Mother Superior who was calling her over. I watched as Sister Anne-Marie went over and spoke with the Mother Superior for several minutes. When she came back, she was obviously flustered. I looked over at the Mother Superior, and she nodded at me as she walked back into the convent. "Mother Superior says we have to bury the bodies," Anne-Marie said, "but we must give them a Christian burial." "Even they would have robbed, raped and killed you?" I asked. "Yes, they are still Christians and God would have forgiven them their sins," she said, and crossed herself. It made no sense to me, but it must have made sense to the nuns. So it was she and the other 2 nuns started to dig graves as I half-carried, half-dragged the bodies to the small cemetery that was on the north side of the convent. Once the bodies were there, I took over the grave digging duties. Luckily, the soil was light and dry. It took less than 2 hours to dig all 4 graves. Once they were dug, I laid the bodies in them and left the nuns to their Christian celebration of death. I went back to the room what was serving as my bedroom. I got undressed and lay down. The nuns took their time with the burial. I decided to close my eyes for a few moments, and I only woke when Sister Anne-Marie brought food, stew and bread and wine for me to drink. The Mother Superior has asked me to thank you for your help today. She has told me to look after your every need until you are well enough to leave us, she said, as I ate the beef stew she had brought with her. It was what any man would have done, I said as I dipped bread into the bowl. Once I had finished the food, I rested the bowl on my chest and let out a loud burp. The food here was good, better than what we were served on board the longboats. Jeroen was a good cook, but he was not in the same league as the nuns. Not many men would have taken on 4 brigands to save us like you did, she said. Her eyes seemed to sparkle in the candlelight. She stood up and took the empty bowl from my chest, and then handed me a goblet. She poured wine into it. As she did so, she slipped and wine slopped over my chest and stomach. Oh my, what a clumsy fool I am, she said, red-faced. I am so sorry, Uthred. Please let me clean that up. She grabbed a cloth from the bedside table and started to wipe the wine from my skin. She took her time and was very attentive. As she cleaned around my nipples, I found that they hardened, and Anne-Marie noticed as well. She wiped down my stomach, and that sent shivers of pleasure through my body. I was covered in a thin blanket, and as my body reacted, it was more than obvious. Sister Anne-Marie let out a gasp as she pulled the blanket back to clean up the wine that had dribbled down into my groin. My cock was as hard as a rock and was pointing straight at her. She used the cloth to clean me up, but I could tell she was more interested in my dick. She skirted around my erection, making sure she did not touch it, but all the time she was staring at it. I just lay back and let her get on with it. If this gorgeous young nun wanted to gaze at my dick, who was I to argue? My body jolted at her delicate touch as I was not expecting it. I felt her stroke my balls. They were heavy and full, and she slipped her soft hand under them and massaged them. She gasped as my cock jerked as she touched me. She ran her fingers through the hair that covered my ball bag. She stood up suddenly and moved towards the door. At first I thought she had had second thoughts and was about to reassure her when I saw she was just closing the door. She slid the bolt across. We would not want to be disturbed, she said as she knelt by the side of the bed. She continued her path of discovery over my bollocks. My cock was now harder than I had ever known it, and was leaking pre-cum. Anne-Marie's fingers slid up the length of my shaft and stroked the mushroom-shaped helmet. She stroked up and down my length, her fingers barely touching me. She had an almost feather-like touch. Her fingers slid around the base of my cock and she started to wank me. Slow strokes, slow and deliberate, slow but firm. He looks so angry and red, she giggled. I said nothing as I was concentrating, trying to make sure I made this experience last as long as possible. As one of her hands gripped the thick base of my cock, the other pulled my foreskin off my cock's helmet, and it was my turn to gasp aloud. Did I hurt you, Uthred? She asked, never taking her eyes off my cock. No, sister, that's nice. I gasped as she did it again. Her fingers stroked and caressed my throbbing organ. Her breathing was getting deeper, and it was obvious that she was getting as turned on as much as I was. The tips of her fingers traced the lines of the veins that crisscrossed my cock. She dipped the tip of one small finger into the pool of clear precum. She then looked into my eyes before sucking the tip of the finger. Ah, that tastes good, she said, and she dipped her finger into the liquid again and licked her finger with relish. Her fingers massaged and fondled my cock, and it was painfully pleasurable. I watched as she leaned forward and blew across the exposed tip of my cock. It was the most amazing sensation. She got nearer and blew again. She was so near to me, if my cock jerked or moved in any way, I was sure it would touch her lips. Anne-Marie's hand was now moving on the base of my cock faster and faster. She was gazing at my cock as if it was a rod of gold. I was grunting with the pleasure, and she just kept wanking me. I felt my balls tighten and my buttocks clenched as I let out a loud grunt, and several strings of thick, creamy cum shot from my cock. The gooey liquid landed on my stomach, and Sister Anne-Marie dipped her head and sucked the cum off me. She was grunting and moaning with pleasure as she cleaned up my seed. I was amazed at the dirtiness of the nun doing things I had only seen done by a cheap tavern whore. She looked up at me, and her lips and chin were shiny with the seed of my loins, and she was smiling like a cat that had got the cream. I looked at her and wanted to fuck her. I reached out for her, and at first, she did not struggle or try to pull away. Then out of nowhere, a bell tolled. It was the bell for evening prayers, and Sister Anne-Marie shook her head at me. "Uthred, this will happen. But I need to get to prayers, or the Mother Superior will have me scrubbing floors for a week." She stood up and wiped a cloth over her mouth. With a quick goodbye, she was gone. I never saw Anne-Marie or the other sisters alive again. The band of Saxon brigands came hard and fast the following morning. They came out of the morning gloom, attacking from the north and south at the same time. They hit the convent hard and with a ferocity that shocked me. I had seen a few battles, but this was like no other. They were killing everyone and everything in sight. I heard them attacking the main building and looked out of the slit window of my tiny cell. As soon as I heard the commotion, I got dressed and armed myself as best I could. I knew that a wooden cudgel and a small knife would be no match for the Saxon swords and spears. They were setting the thatched roofs alight and screaming out curses. I heard them calling out to each other. They were looking for me. The price on my head was obviously worth attacking nuns for. Luckily for me, they had aimed their attack on the main building, and the row of outbuildings and tiny cells that I was billeted in was not yet being searched. I watched as they broke down doors and stormed into the convent. Animals squealed in pain as they were indiscriminately chopped down. Nuns screamed for God's help, but he was no help to them that day. I slipped out of the door into the courtyard and hid in the shadows. I thought about challenging them, but there were far too many. The warband must have numbered upwards of 50 men. They were well armed, and I could sense their battle lust. I watched as they ripped the place apart, smashing down the doors, and I wept as I heard the nuns screaming as they were put to the sword. Some of them tried to fight for their lives, but they had little to offer in the way of defence. Broom handles against swords was never going to be a fair match. Sometimes in battle, you need to know when to attack and when to retreat, and I knew my only option was to get away from this butcher's yard. I slipped out of a tiny side gate and ran out into the forest. They had posted one guard and he was facing away from the convent. I sneaked past him to avoid him shouting out and giving me away. I felt bad about it, but there was nothing I could do. I just kept running, with lungs burning and branches ripping at my skin. The darkness was lifting from the land as I reached the summit of a small hill around a mile from the convent. I looked back over the trees. Smoke drifted up, and even from this distance I could see that they had destroyed the convent and all of its outbuildings. Flammes were licking from some of the windows. I guessed that there was no one alive down there. I turned away and started to walk toward the sea. I knew the only chance I had to regroup with my comrades was to get to the sea and hope to either see a Viking ship or steal a boat. I walked slowly, making sure that I was not seen. If I came across a village, I skirted around it, and that took me the long way. That night I killed a small deer and ate it raw, fearful that a fire would alert any passing Saxons. The following morning brought rain and mist, and that made me walk faster. I reached the outskirts of another small village by mid-afternoon and slipped into the roof space of a small barn. I slept well that evening and refreshed myself by drinking cow's milk. As evening turned to night, I used the darkness to explore my surroundings. The darkness cloaked me as I wandered around. By the sound of the snoring, I could tell the villagers were all asleep, and I saw they had posted no guards or lookouts. There were less than 20 houses and a small tavern in the village. A river led to a small beach, had several boats pulled high on the sand, avoiding any waves. All were too big for me to drag down to the water on my own. I did manage to steal some bread and cheese from the hold of one of the boats, and I took these back to the barn. I decided that I needed to wait for the right moment. There was no point trying to rush into the village. Even a few fishermen could overcome the attack of one warrior. The following morning brought me some luck, as was awoken by the noise of a market being set up. I could see down into the village square through a gap in the wall of the barn. Stalls were selling all kinds of goods. The tavern was already serving ale and food. The air was filled with the noise and smell of the market. There were already over 100 people milling around the square. I would be able to use this to my advantage. I knew that a stranger in a quiet village would stand out like a sore thumb, but a stranger at a market was altogether different. I would not stand out, and that would allow me to take a good look around the place. I slipped out of the back door of the barn and headed through the forest away from the village. I got to an ideal place. A curve in the road would give me the perfect spot. I lay on the slope of a small wooded hill and watched the road. Several groups of people walked past me, but none were suitable. I played the waiting game. Finding the right person was the key to my plan. I found my target leading a small, unladen donkey toward the market. I quickly surmised from this that he was buying, not selling. This was my target, as no one goes to the market to buy without some money. I worked my way through the trees until I was behind him and started my attack. I slid out of the bushes and used my cudgel to smash the man to the ground. As soon as he hit the floor, my small blade slid over his throat and took the last of his breath. He was a heavy man, and it took me a while to drag him out of sight. As soon as the body was hidden, I spread soil over the pool of blood that had been left by the side of the road. I did not want anyone to spot the point of the attack and raise an alarm. A search of the body revealed a small bag of gold coins and some other trinkets. I released the donkey from its halter, and with money in my pocket, it headed toward the market. I figured as long as I did not speak, I could pass as a Saxon. I took the man's cape and hat. They were not the best of fits, but they would do for now. My body was shaking with nerves as I sidled into the market square. I tried to act naturally, looking at stalls and wandering around. I was still a Viking in a Saxon village and grossly outnumbered. If I was spotted, I was a dead man. I edged my way nearer and nearer to the beach. I could see that there were 1 or 2 boats moored out in deeper water. One craft looked ideal for me, not too big for one man to sail, but it had to be big enough to take 2 out to sea. It was also moored next to a small wooden jetty. There was one man on the deck, sunning himself whilst guarding it. The small cabin had a closed door, and I could not be sure that there were no other sailors on board. The single sail was down, but I was sure I could hoist it fairly quickly. There was a fair wind, and I could only hope to get a head start on anyone that might chase after me. I edged my way through the crowd toward the jetty. My footsteps seemed to echo across the water, but as I glanced back over my shoulder, no one was taking any notice of me. I walked past the man on the boat. Once I was on his blind side, I quickly stepped onto the boat and clamped my hand over his mouth. I dragged him to the deck, and as my blade took his windpipe, any struggle was taken from him, and I dropped him to the deck. I slipped forward and cast off the moorings. The small craft started to drift on the current made by the river. I lay on the deck and kept my eyes on the jetty, just waiting for the crowd to erupt and come storming after me. It never happened. Once I had drifted around 100 yards, I quickly hoisted the sail, and after rolling the crewmen into the water, I took the tiller and let the wind take me out to sea. I sailed hard for 2 hours, always expecting to turn back and see a fleet of boats tracking me down. They never chased me, and I was glad of that, as I had no weapons to speak of. This got me thinking, so I tied the tiller, and having grabbed my cudgel, I unlocked the cabin door. There was some bedding in one corner, and some food on the tiny shelves that had on one of the cabin walls. It was a tiny living space. The cupboards held no surprises. A few tools, one decent short sword and some fishing gear. I took the sword back on deck and moved toward the front of the boat. There was a small covered cargo hold. I slid back the cover and jumped backwards. 2 faces stared up at me, eyes blinking at the sunlight. I had nothing to fear. Both faces belonged to young girls. Both were gagged and tied to hooks attached to the side of the boat. One was a pretty little thing, and the other was a more buxom lass. But at the same time pretty, with bright blue eyes, I dropped down into the cargo hold and slipped off the gags. Both women gasped for air. "Who are you?" asked the buxom girl. "Have you bought us, sir?" And I cut the ropes holding them down and helped them up onto the deck. They stretched and looked around them. It was obviously they had been held captive for quite a while. "No, I have not bought you. I have stolen this boat, but you are free to go," I replied with a smile. I introduced myself, and they told me their names were Rosie and Matilda. They were both just 16 and cousins. We sat at the tiller and I told them my story. I was sure once they heard I was a Viking they would panic, but they took it in their stride. They told me they had been kidnapped by a local sailor to be sold as slaves. They seemed happy to have been released and happier to be able to help themselves to food and water. We sailed down the coast until the light started to wane. As the twilight started to dull the day, I headed into a small secluded cove, sailed as close to the beach as I dared and dropped the anchor. The girls followed me over the side of the boat and together waded up to the sandy beach. "Well, girls, it's your choice now," I said. "If you wish to go, I will let you take food and water enough to last you a few days." They looked at each other and both replied at the same time that they would like to stay with me for the time being. We made plans. I took the sword and head up the rocks to scout the area. The girls started to collect driftwood for a fire. I climbed the rocks to the cliff top and took a long look around. The place seemed fairly deserted. There was no evidence of anyone and no fires or smoke to show any villages nearby. As I headed back down toward the beach, I spotted a small deer and managed to hit it hard enough with a rock to slow it down before dispatching it with my blade. I threw it over my shoulder and carried it down for the girls. As soon as I dropped it on the sand, Matilda, the buxom one, took my knife and started to prepare it for cooking. She was adept at the work, and it was not long before the smell of cooking meat filled the cove. She looked up at me and smiled. "There is wine in the hold if you would like some," she said in a sweet voice. She looked like she could be fun in the right circumstances. I jumped aboard the boat and searched the hold. I came back with wine, goblets and plates. Looking around, I saw that Rosie was sitting on the rocks further out into the cove. Matilda saw me looking. "She is using a hook and line to catch fish," she told me. I sat on the sand with my back resting on a rock. The smell of the cooking meat drifted past me and I took a swig of wine. Perhaps things were looking up. I had a craft, food and wine, plus 2 delightful girls to keep me company as I searched for my own kind. We ate well that night, with roast meat and fish. The wine made us all sleepy, and I was careless in that I let the girls sleep on the boat and I lay by the fire. They could have taken the boat that night and left me for dead. Luckily for me, they were true to their word. A noise awoke me, splashing water. My eyes opened and then closed at the brightness of morning sun. I had slept well. I stood up looking for the source of the splashing as I stretched my weary limbs. I looked out past where the boat was moored, and I saw Matilda dive into the water from the rocks. She was buck naked, and even from a distance, she looked fine. I stood up and shrugged off my clothes and strode into the water. I plunged into the cold water and swam toward where Matilda was swimming. As I got closer, she turned toward a small sandy patch, and I watched as she waded out of the water and lay on the sand. Her body was amazing. I swam to where she lay, and she watched every step as got out of the water. My cock was already hard as I knelt next to her. "Uthred, are you excited to see me?" She laughed, then reached out and wrapped her hand around my cock. I could hear the blood pulsing in my temples, and as her fingers stroked the skin of my taut cock. She then knelt in front of me and slowly massaged my cock, her face only inches from its exposed helmet. She was so close I could feel her breath on the exposed glands. I felt her left hand cup my balls, and she massaged those as she slowly wanked my cock. She used the fingers of her right hand to make a circle around my cock and rubbed it slowly and firmly. Matilda whipped out her tongue and licked the tip of my cock like a lizard taking an insect. The pain and pleasure that I felt were amazing. Both emotions ran through my body like bolts of lightning. She licked the rim of my helmet, and every now and then she licked up and down the shaft. Her lips formed a circle and slid down over my cock head and down its shaft. The pleasure was intense as she slowly fucked my cock with her mouth. Her head moved back and forwards in a slow, steady rhythm. My hips started to move in time with her movements. Matilda took her hand off my bollocks, and I felt both hands grip my buttocks. She was now moving me back and forth. I was rocking on my heels, watching my dick slide in and out of her warm, wet mouth. My shaft was now shining with her saliva. Her lips were sucking on me and her tongue was massaging the bottom of my throbbing dick. I felt the urge and the pressure of my cum boiling in my bollocks. I grabbed the back of Matilda's head and started to face fuck her. Driving my cock deep into her mouth, at first she gagged, but after 2 strokes she was pulling me into her. Her hands gripped the skin on my arse, digging her nails into the flesh. I knew I was going to come when my thighs started to shake as they always did. The first spurt flew from my cock and hit the back of her throat. This made her jerk her head backwards and my cock slipped from her mouth. My second spurt of cum hit her square in the face, as did the third and fourth. Matilda slipped her lips over my cock and sucked hard, cleaning off any spunk with her tongue. I looked down at her face, and my seed was rolling down her face. She was taking it all in her stride, the dirty whore. After a few more minutes of sucked and stroking my still hard cock, Matilda let it drop from her mouth. She looked up at me and smiled. "So, my Lord Uthred, would you like to plough my field?" she asked with a little giggle. She did not wait for me to answer before flipping over onto her hands and knees and presenting her arse to me. I knelt behind her and took my organ in my hand. I moved in close and rubbed the shiny red helmet of my cock down the crack of her arse and over her pussy. I was stroking it up and down her wet crack. Matilda was pushing her arse back toward me. I positioned my cock and thrust forward, sliding deep into her wet pussy with one easy stroke. I grabbed her broad hips and started to drive my cock in and out of her cunt. I reached under and grabbed a handful of her firm breast flesh, and from the groan that girl let out, it was something that she liked. My cock was now driving in and out of her pussy. Nice, long, slow strokes, and I bottomed out into her. I squeezed her tits. She was obvious getting as turned on as I was. Her thighs were shiny with her juices, and there was a sexy squelch every time I drove into her. I felt her strong muscles massaging my cock as it slid into her pussy. Faster and faster I drove into her. Matilda was now panting and groaning loudly. I felt my orgasm welling up inside me, and that made me stab my cock into her harder. I felt Matilda quiver and shake. A loud yell exploded from her mouth as she rode the wave of her own orgasm. I felt a hot rush of fluid flood out of her cunt, and that took me over the edge. My second orgasm of the day was even more intense than the first, and I emptied my balls into her. It took a while for both of us to calm down after that. I dropped back on my haunches and my cock slid from her pussy. I looked at her. My seed was dripping out of her and dropping onto the sand. Her thighs were covered in a sheen of her sweaty excitement. We sat there for a while, then Matilda sort of flopped onto the sand and rolled onto her back. Her big tits looked amazing in the morning sun. We smiled at each other, not talking for a while. "That was great, thank you, Uthred," she said, and kissed me on the lips. "Thank you, my lady," I said as we broke the kiss. As she stood up, she strode into the water and started to wash herself. I did the same, and as we stood waist-deep in the cool, clear water with waves lapping around us, we kissed, embracing as lovers do. The feeling of her huge tits on my chest was amazing, and I felt myself getting hard again. I grabbed her ample arse and started to grind myself against Matilda, hoping for a second helping. She just laughed and pushed me away. "You're a greedy boy, Uthred," she giggled. As I turned back toward our boat, I saw that Rosie was standing on the beach watching us. I wondered how long she had been watching. I wondered if she minded that I had just fucked her cousin. And I wondered if I might also fuck her before we went our separate ways. I washed away the smell of our sex and got dressed. Rosie had cooked some of the leftover meat for our breakfast. We ate in silence, but as we were starting to pack up our little overnight camp, she sidled up to me and grabbed my arse. "I hope I get some of that soon, Uthred. We are cousins and we share everything." And with a cheeky grin, she was gone. We sailed out of the cove and into open water. The wind was good to us and took us along the coast at quite a pace. We saw no ships, only a few small fishing boats. We kept our distance and avoided any trouble. The girls had some experience of sailing smaller boats, so they soon got the hang of the bigger vessel. The morning turned to afternoon and the afternoon turned to evening, and we had sailed a fair way without having to defend ourselves. That evening we sailed toward a small island that was around 2 miles from the coast. It was so small I circled it twice looking for signs of life, but there was nothing. There was a small natural harbour with a wall of rocks that shielded the beach from the sea. It was ideal. The harbour also looked like the only place a boat could land, making it easy to spot trouble. We dropped the sails and let the momentum of the boat take us toward the sandy beach. I dived into the water, and Rosie threw me a rope. There was a tree close to the beach, and the rope was tied around it, making the boat safe. The girls made a great team, and they were soon setting up a little camp high up the beach in the shade of the trees. I, meanwhile, took a quiet look around the island. It had a stream but little wildlife, so it would be fish, and more fish to eat. I climbed some rocks and looked out across the sea. Nothing, not a sail in sight. That evening we built a fire and ate the last of our meat and a little fish. The evening was cool, and I fetched cloaks and blankets from the boat's cabin. There was no way of knowing where in the world I was, but I knew we were sailing north. I was hoping that at some point a longship would spot us, and that I could persuade the crew that I was Uthred, son of Uthred of Verdok. The hold of the boat held nothing more than a few spices and keg of beer. We would soon need to find supplies, and that would be hard. Matilda was soon under a blanket and snoring. I thought Rosie was asleep as well, so I walked up the beach and clambered over some rocks. I had always been a great explorer, even as a child. I sat on a small hummock and watched the bats flit around the trees in the moonlight. A small noise startled me, and I grabbed my knife. "It's only me, Uthred," Rosie said, and she stepped out of the shadows. She stood before me and slipped off her cloak. She was naked. Her body was not as voluptuous as her cousin's, but no less sexy. Her nipples already stood proud in the cool evening air. I stood up and took her in my arms. We kissed and our tongues wrestled. My hands stroked and caressed her back before cupping her buttocks. Rosie was grinding herself into me, and I knew she was as horny as I was. I stepped back and dropped my cloak, quickly undressing. As I did so, Rosie was stroking her own tits, tugging at her nipples and eyeing up my hard cock. As soon as I was unburdened by clothes, she spat into her own hand and wrapped it around my throbbing dick. Her hand stroked up and down my shaft as we kissed. I slipped a hand between us and stroked her pussy, forcing 3 fingers inside. She was wet, and I was eager. It was Rosie that broke our embrace. "Lie down, Uthred," she ordered, and I did as I was asked. Rosie moved until she was standing over me, and then straddled my head, lowering her pussy to my face. I reached up, grabbing her hips, and pulled her onto me. My tongue searched out her clit, and I started to lick and suck on it. She was wet and tasty, and the more I licked, the more she ground her pussy onto my face. Her love juice was dripping onto my face. I started to lick up and down her slit, opening it up with my tongue. At the same time, I slid a hand over her arse and started to rub her arsehole with the tip of one finger. She must have liked this, as I felt her weight shift, and then the lovely warmth of her lips around my cock. I licked deeper and harder, forcing my tongue into her velvety cunt. The smell and the heat drove me on like a wolf devouring its prey. All the time Rosie was sucking my cock and stroking my balls. I slipped my finger into her arse, and that made her gasp. At the same time, I started to suck her clit harder and harder, using the tip of my tongue to massage it. I knew she was getting close when she started to grind onto my tongue, and then she let out a huge groan and her face was flooded with warm, sticky juice as she came all over me. She kept grinding onto my face for a few minutes until her groaning and panting subsided. I was a little pissed off. Rosie had stopped sucking when she started to come, and I was eager to shoot my load into her mouth. I thought our little encounter was over when she raised her hips, but I was wrong. With a deft little movement, she moved her hips forward over my chest and over my crotch. She stuck one hand between her thighs and grabbed my cock, guiding it to her cunt before dropping down and taking my full length in one movement. I gasped with pleasure, and she groaned. I felt her hands on my knees, and then with a sigh, Rosie started to ride my cock. It was a pleasure to watch as my cock, shiny with her juices, slid in and out of her pussy. I could see her excitement glimmering in the moonlight, and on every downstroke my nose was filled with the perfume of her lust. I just lay back and enjoyed the ride, and what a ride it was. Rosie bounced up and down on my hard dick for what seemed like ages. As I felt my own orgasm rising up, I reached forward and used the tip of my finger to massage her anus. This drove her over the edge, and she banged hard and harder on my cock until I thought my balls would explode with the pressure. I am sure my groan would have been heard in Valhalla as I grabbed her hips and drove my cock into her, at the same time feeling my cum shoot deep into her. The feeling of my cock exploding inside her and my cum flooding her cunt took Rosie over the edge again, and she wailed with pleasure as her body shook as she came. It took a few minutes for us both to recover from the power of that orgasm. I could still feel my cock throbbing as I walked back down the beach with Rosie. We bathed together before settling under a blanket naked together. I was still naked under the blanket when I awoke. The sun was high in the sky but was blotted out by the broad shoulders of several Viking warriors. All were armed and wearing armour. Rosie's screams awoke Matilda and she joined in the din. I looked around. The beach was filled with armed men and I was naked under a blanket with only a small cooking knife to hand. I couldn't see their faces as the sun was high behind them. I stood and one stepped toward me and held out his hand. I was as naked as a newborn babe, but he pulled me to my feet. It was Halfdan, and behind him stood Arvid. I pulled on my clothes and the girls used some sea cloaks volunteered by my men to hide their modesty. The beach was full of men and 3 ships rocked in the swell behind them. I looked around and saw many faces I knew from my ship, and some I did not. There was lots of cheering and back-slapping as the crew came forward, happy to see their master alive and well. Fires were lit and food was cooked. We sat around listening to each other's tales. I told mine and the men were all amazed at my luck and guile. They told me how the Saxons had come out of the trees and swamped our camp. Many had survived, some had not, and some were missing. Jarun and Lucille were among the missing. Vegoff had died on the beach. He died a hero making time for others to escape by taking the fight to the Saxons, I was told. Our losses that day were huge, but everyone agreed someday. Soon we would get our revenge. My men knew the name of the Saxon lord that had gathered men and attacked them, and they knew where his village was. That was a good thing as I vowed revenge for the losses to my crew. In front on the huge fire the crews had raised I vowed to kill Lord Aldwyn, and my crew joined me in my battle cries. Morning stretched into the afternoon into the evening, and it was decided that the crews of the ships would camp on our little island until the morning tide. Men made little camps, all over the place. Soon there was the normal camp sounds. Men snoring, men arguing, men rutting the camp's whores. Weapons being sharpened. I took Rosie and Matilda to a small clearing as my men went about their business. So girls, tomorrow I sail north to see my father, and you have an option. Come with me, or take the boat and fend for yourselves, I said with a smile. They looked at each other. Will we be your women, Uthred? Asked Rosie. Yes, I will house you and care for you, and you can both share my bed, I replied. If that's what you both want. Matilda looked at Rosie, and then they both looked at me, and both nodded. The sky was now dark, and the evening heat was dwindling. We should get some sleep, I told them, even though sleep was the last thing on my mind. The trip back to my father's village will take 3 days or more, and there is little rest to be had on the ship, I told them. We used my short sword to cut some heather to make a bed big enough for the 3 of us, and covered it in our sea cloaks. I slipped my clothes off and got under the cloaks. Matilda was the first to undress, and I could make out her plump pussy and big tits as she laid her clothes on a bush. Rosie followed her, and they were soon both under the cloaks, one either side of me, both as naked as a newborn baby. It was Rosie that took the first move. Her hand slid along my thigh and took my prick in her fist and started wanking me. Matilda moved up the makeshift bed and slipped her big tit onto my mouth, and I suckled on her engorged nipple. Rosie pulled the cloak off me and knelt next to me. After a moment looking at my cock, she reached out both hands to caress my balls and cock. She took her time stroking, caressing, and squeezing my manhood. It was now as hard as iron, and she spat on it, using her spittle as a lubricant as she wanked me off. "I love the feel of your cock in my hand, master," she whispered as she continued to stroke my cock, holding it firmly and milking it gently. Matilda pulled one tit from my mouth and replaced it with the other. She had huge nipples that grew hard as I sucked and nibbled on them. I slipped a hand down between Rosie's thighs and found her pussy, and drove 2 fingers into her tight little hole. She gasped but did not stop wanking me. I felt her shift and then the gorgeous feeling as her lips encompassed my cock's crown. She sucked on me and her fingers stroked my hairy balls. Rosie licked up and down my hard shaft as I finger-fucked her. All the time I was feasting on Matilda's huge tits. Rosie was some cocksucker. She took me deep into her mouth and held me while her tongue danced around my shaft. My fingers were now working on her pussy, soaring in and out, and her juices coated my hand. I slipped my hand from her and sucked my digits clean. "Does she taste good, master?" Matilda asked innocently. "She does," I replied and slipped my hand back into her cousin's hot, wet pussy. I presented my wet, sticky fingers to Matilda, and she sucked them dry, and when she had finished me, let out a little contented sigh. I got the feeling it was not the first time she had tasted her cousin's pussy juices. "Do I taste that good, master?" she asked, and as she said is, she straddled my face and dropped her plump pussy onto my face. I flicked my tongue out and licked along her gash. Then I wiggled it inside her and started to eat her slowly, taking my time to savour her delights. She was soon wet, and I slurped at her juices. She started to grind down onto me, and I ate her for all I was worth. I licked up and down her pussy before flicking my tongue over her clit. I sucked on her lust-thickened labia and forced my tongue deep into her coral-pink pussy. She was so wet her juices seeped out all over my face as I gorged myself on her. I felt my cock going deeper and deeper into Rosie's mouth, and I knew I would shoot my load soon. Rosie was sucking me for all she was worth. Her hand wrapped around the base of my cock and she wanked me into her willing mouth. My balls tightened and I knew I would climax soon. Matilda was humping my face as I ate her delicious cunt. She was moaning almost continuously, groaning and gasping as she worked her plump cunt on face. I soon had her clit between my lips and was working hard at it. I used my tongue to lick at it, my mouth to suck on it, and my lips to massage it. That took her over the edge, and she let out an animalistic grunt, and my face was awash with her hot, sticky juices. "Uthred, I am coming, I am coming." She cried as I sucked and licked on her love button. Her orgasm sent me over the edge as well, and I felt my cock swell and jerk in Rosie's mouth, and I felt my cum explode from my cock into her mouth. She was a good girl and swallowed the lot. When I had stopped shooting my cum, she rocked back on her haunches and laughed. "Fuck me, that tasted good, master," she said. Matilda rolled off me, and I watched as she went straight down on my semi-erect cock, licking up the cum that was oozing from its crown, then taking me into her mouth and sucking me clean. "Our master's cum does taste good," Matilda gasped as she licked and sucked my cock. She soon had my cock at full mast. "So girls who wants to be ploughed first?" I laughed. They looked at each other and smiled. "Rosie should go first tonight," Matilda said, her hand wanking my cock with vigour. "So Rosie, how would you like to be fucked?" I asked, as I watched Matilda big tits swing as she hand-fucked me. "I want to ride you like a horse, master," she declared with a giggle. "So be it," I cried. "Mount me, girl." She straddled me and Matilda rubbed my cock over Rosie's wet pussy. She rubbed it back and forth. I felt Matilda push me into her pussy, and as Rosie felt my cock in the head of her cunt, she lowered herself back onto, and then she started to ride me. She started a slow up and down movement on my cock. She moved slowly, leaning to day me so her cute little titties dangled before my face. I sucked on her nipples, chewing them gently as she ground her hips down onto mine, riding my cock slowly and firmly. "Yes, oh yes, lick and suck them," she gasped, and I did just that, sucking the firm flesh into my mouth. After a while she sat up straight, giving me the chance to study this beautiful girl and her outstanding body. Her tits were smaller than Matilda's, but firm and capped with big berry-coloured nipples that were erect. She had a flat stomach and an amazing smile. Her hair danced as she fucked me, and soon her face was a mask of sweat and concentration. Up and down, back and forth, she rode me like a stallion. "Oh my God," she moaned. "That feels amazing, Uthred." Then she closed her eyes and started to grind her pussy up and down on my cock. I reached up and took her gorgeous orbs in my hands, cupping, fondling, massaging. My fingers tweaked her nipples, making them grow harder and bigger. She kept riding me up and down, back and forth, back and forth. My cock felt like it was being held in a tight fist as she fucked me slowly and deliberately. She paused and started a slow up and down movement. A gentle fucking movement that got faster and harder as my prick drove her deeper and harder into her love tunnel. I could feel her pulsing pussy around my hard shaft. I looked over the where Matilda was sitting. She had her legs wide open and was playing with her pussy as I fucked her cousin. She had the fingers of one hand frigging her clit and the 3 fingers of the other hand deep in her pussy. She had her eyes glued on us as we fucked. My hand slipped off Rosie's titties and I grabbed her hips and helped her to rock back and forth on my cock. She was rocking back and forth, back and forth. Her hands dropped onto my chest as she worked harder and harder on my cock. Rosie started to groan and moan, and her movements slowed. I started to drive my hips up at her, fucking her harder and harder. Her eyes opened wide and she gazed down at me as I fucked deeper and harder. My cock was driving deeper and deeper into her. "Fuck me, Uthred," she groaned. "Fuck me harder, please, master." I pulled her to me and rolled her over so she was beneath me. I pulled her legs up onto my shoulders and started to plunder her pussy. I watched as my cock slid in and out of her wet pussy. It was shiny with her juices. I reached down and lubricated my thumb with her juices before appling it to her clit. I was soon frigging it hard. My hips drove my prick harder and deeper into her, and all the time I could feel her muscles pulsing around the hard shaft as it drove into her deeper and harder. My ears were full of the sound of flesh pounding on flesh and the moans and groans of Rosie as she thrashed about beneath me. I saw movement to my left and watched as Matilda moved over and dropped her big tits into Rosie's face. Rosie grabbed one big boob in each and started to suck on them. It didn't take long for the thrusts of my cock and the work my thumb was doing on her clit to send her into rapturous orgasm. She groaned and I felt her quim tighten around my dick. Then she let out a low, deep moan of pleasure. Her legs started to tense and intense, and I felt her pussy muscles clamping onto my cock, almost milking the cum from my balls. "Ah, yes, yes, yes," she cried as her climax travelled out from her pussy to every corner of her body. I let her ride out her climax before I pulled my cock from her and saw it was covered with her juices. I rocked back on my haunches and looked down at Rosie. Her body was bathed in sweat and still twitching. I stood and took a gulp of water from a flask we had brought with us. As I drank, Matilda sat up and smiled at me. "My turn, master?" she inquired eagerly. "Yes, it is your turn now, girl," I replied. "So, how do you want to be ploughed?" "Take me like a beast, please, master," she said, and with that, she shifted so she was kneeling between her cousin's thighs. I knelt behind her and took my cock in my hand. I gave it a few strokes to encourage it back to full strength and rubbed its wet tip down Matilda's arse crack and along her wet pussy. I pushed its crown into her tight cunt and she gasped. I pulled out and pushed it again. "Master, please don't tease me," she cried. I grabbed her broad hips and drove deep into her, so hard and fast my balls swung up and bounced off her plump pussy. I started to bang my cock into her in hard thrusts, deep into her tight pussy. I saw her head dip, and I could see Rosie's face over Matilda's head. Rosie's face a mask of pleasure, and the way that Matilda's head was bobbing up and down, there was only one reason for it. So I fucked Matilda's pussy as she ate Rosie's pussy, and it made me as horny as hell. I pulled her hips back onto me as I drove into her. Faster and harder I drove. My ears were full of the sound of flesh pounding off flesh and the combined moans and groans of the girls. Matilda was getting close to her orgasm. Her body was shaking as I fucked her. She thrust back to meet me as I thrust into her. I gripped her hips, giving me much more leverage to drive my cock deeper inside her. I was driving deeper and harder. I started to fuck her harder, thrusting deeper, giving her all that I had. I felt my own climax approaching, and with a grunt, I felt my cock jerk and I shot my cum deep inside her pussy. She came as my seed shot deep into her. She climaxed with a shudder, and then her whole body convulsed as she cried out my name. I kept fucking her until my cock lost its ardour and slipped from her wet pussy. Matilda rolled onto her back and smiled up at me. I lay beside her on our heather bed. "Oh, Uthred, that was a mazing," she said. Her breathing was laboured. Rosie slipped to her knees beside me and took my cock in her mouth, sucking me clean of the copious juices, both mine and Matilda's, that coated it. I lay back on our heather bed, and the girls took a position either side of me. They were still there, their heads on my chest, when the morning sun rose and woke us. I could see the crews of the ships breaking camp, loading their bedding and cooking tools onto the ship. I woke the girls and we all dressed and hurried to the beach. Halfdan created me with a knowing smile. "Good morning, Uthred," he said. "Did you sleep well, master?" I gave him a gentle punch and wink. "Yes, I did." "Well, it's time we got moving. The tide and wind is with us and we will make good headway," he said, picking up his weapons. We boarded the longboat and the shipmaster had men push us into deeper water before ordering men to the oars. It took half an hour of rowing before the sails went up and the wind drove us north, home to my father's village. The wind was good, and it was 3 very uneventful days later that we sailed into the small natural harbour that serviced my father's village in Northumberland. There were over a dozen longships in the bay, and men crowded the beach as we approached. As we fit the beach, I was over the side, and my father met me with a bear hug. I saw Gudver on the beach, and we embraced as well. He told me they had managed to get my treasure ship back without a problem, and that the treasure was in my father's store. That made me a happy and rich man. That night and well into the following morning we feasted, we ate and drank. Men fought, women got ploughed. Stories were told. It was last afternoon when I left the small cottage my father had given me to live in with the girls. It was a dirty hovel, but as I left the girls had borrow brushes and pails of water and were cleaning it up. I sought counsel with my father and we sat outside his huge hall and I told him my story. I told him that I wanted to take men back and seek revenge on the Saxon lord Aldwin. "Father, I need to kill this Saxon and show other Saxons that they do not mess with Vikings," I told him as we drank water and ate bread. "Uthred, I agree, and I will give you men and ships," he said as one of the slave girls poured more water into our cups. "But Aldwin commands a huge army and we need more men." "What do you suggest, father?" "I can offer you 3 ships and 3 full ships. Crews," he replied, "some warriors as well, but that no more than 150 men." "Yes, we would need more," I said, break another chunk of bread off the loaf. "Your uncle, Arnlo, could bring men. He loves the Saxons as much as we do." My father laughed. Arnlug lived a further up the coast from us. It was a 3 full-day boat trip. "I suggest you take a few days to rest and plough those 2 girls before we raise a crew and sail to see Arnlaug and ask for his help," my father replied with a smile. So that is what I did. I ploughed the girls every night and rested every day. My weapons and armour were lost, but my father gave me free rein to take what I needed from his stores. That meant I also took time to share out the treasure that we had sent back to the village. With my share I paid my father's smith to make me 2 new swords. It was 7 days later that I stood on the beach kissing the girls and say my goodbyes, as were the rest of the crewmen. I would be gone for 10 days or more. My father gave me a small treasure chest as a gift for my uncle, his younger brother. We rowed out of the harbour and both Halfdan and I took a turn on the long oars. It was back-breaking work, but it gave a man muscles, and muscles were good in battle. We rowed in the morning sun and made good time as the winds and tides were kind to us. Each night we sailed close to the shore and camped when it looked safe to. It was noon on the 3rd day that we sailed toward the beach next to my uncle's village. Lookouts must have seen us, as soon the beach was filled with armed men. I raised my father's banner to let the men on the beach know who I was. The last thing I wanted was to be met by a flurry of throwing axes. I jumped from the boat with Halfdan and Gudver. We went unarmed. It was both dangerous and disrespectful to go ready for war. Uthred. I heard a huge roar, and the warriors on the beach parted as my uncle approached, followed by my cousin Odolf. They were both huge men. We embraced. "Well, boy, you have grown," he said as he took me by the arm and led me into the village. It had been 3 years since we had last visited. Soon I was sat with Halfdan and Gudver and my uncle and his trusted warriors in his hall, feasting on bread, cheese and beer. I told him my tale and how I sought revenge on the Saxon Lord Aldwin. He knew of him. I am told he commands over 500 men and has a huge hoard of treasure. Said Uncle Arnlaug, one of his warriors, Esbjorn, said he had heard he had a hall full of gold coins, and other men joined in with their thoughts. I knew that some of the stories, if not all, would have been embellished 100 times over. But still there is no smoke without fire, as they say. My uncle brought the council to order. "So what men can your father spare?" he asked. My father commanded over a dozen ships' crews. But all good lords knew that leave their homestead unguarded was a huge mistake. "We can bring 3 crews, perhaps 150 men," I told him. He grunted, and after a few minutes' deliberation, he spoke. "So, Uthred, if I matched that with 3 of my own ships, do you think we can defeat that Saxon bastard?" He growled. I was young and stubborn and should have thought longer and harder about that question, but the rashness of youth prevailed. "Yes, Lord," I said. As I did so, I glanced at Halfdan and Gudver, and they did not look as confident. So that day he promised to send 3 ships with 150 men to be commanded by Esbjorn, my cousin, Audolf, and his senior shipmaster Kleng. Kleng was a monster of a man, and rumour had it, he once pulled the head of a Saxon with his bare hands. He also promised to speak to his spies, the travelling traders and entertainers, who fed him information in exchange for gold coins. That day we feasted and slept where we fell, and the following morning we sailed home to await my uncle's men who would arrive in a week. Those 7 days went past in a blur. Every day Halfdan, Gudver and I trained the crews of our ships. They were a mix of battle-ready men and young boys. Every morning I had them out in the longboats rowing up and down the coast, building up their muscles and their stamina. Every afternoon we practiced swordcraft, and every evening it was shield wall training. Shield wall after the shield wall was formed. I knew that the battle we faced would be a hard one, and men had to be ready to fight for their lives. We had them form shield wall after shield wall deep into the evening. I even woke them in the middle of the night and made them form the wall. A good wall can save lives and can scare the enemy. Every evening I ploughed my 2 lovely girls. They had cleaned up the cottage and the place looked like a home. Every night they cooked, and after we had eaten I took my pleasure with them. Sometimes one at a time, and sometimes the pair of them joined me in the bed. I remember those evenings fondly. It was 7 days since I had left my uncle's village, and true to his word, he sent 3 ships and nearly 200 well-armed men. The lookouts saw them approaching and called us to the beach. The 3 ships led by Esbjorn, Audolf and Kleng drew up to the beach. Their crews were soon off the boats and they looked like a handy bunch. They were well armed and looked like a proper Viking warband. Introductions were made and a camp was formed for them. Fires were raised and the beach was soon full of the smell of cooking. A council of war was held in my father's huge hall. All the senior warriors and shipmasters attended. The plan of attack was worked out and reworked several times. Kleng was all for rushing into the Saxon stronghold and fighting to the death. Gudver suggested laying siege to the village and starving them out. Other men offered different ideas, some good and some bad. My uncle's spies told us that the Lord Aldwin had at least 500 men in his own village, a mix of warriors, foot soldiers and fishermen. But he could call on another 600 men from the villages around his. He ruled these villages with an iron fist and they dared not ignore his call. So we could be facing a force over 1,000 men, and that meant we were well outnumbered. I guessed our force at 350 to 400 men. The final plan was to try to dwindle down their numbers by attacking some of the surrounding villages and killing as many men as we could before they grouped together. It was agreed that we would leave at dawn the following day. My father and his senior men sacrificed a horse to Odin, the god of war, and asked for his help and guidance in our battle with the Saxon lords. We all watched as the beast was drained of blood, and men took turns drinking from horns filled with the still warm liquid. My father laid on a huge feast that night. Cattle were killed and cooked over huge fires, and barrels of beer were brought into the hall. That night we ate, sang and drank, and some men whored. I sat at the top table with Matilda and Rosie either side of me. Men drank like it was their last feast, and, in my mind, I thought for some it might be. We stopped in the hall until just after midnight. I ploughed both girls before I passed out drunk, and I awoke the following morning as the sun came up. I kissed both girls and promised them I would return before heading down to the beach. Men were wandering around, kissing loved ones, loading stores and weapons onto the ships. There was a somber mood on the beach. I think we all knew that this was a fight that could go either way. My father stood flanked either side by his warrior bodyguards. He looked worried. "Uthred, be careful," he said as we embraced. "These Saxons outnumber you, and they are battle-hardened." "I will, father," I promised. He told Halfdan and Gudver to look after me, and then turned away and walked up the foreshore as the boats were pushed into deeper water. I stood on the prow of my ship as men took to the oars and started to turn us toward open water. My girls Rosie and Matilda came to the beach and waved me off, as did many of the other men's women. Cleng was on the prow of the ship next to mine. "Uthred, you lucky bastard," he shouted. "If there was any reason to win this fight and return quickly, it's the thought of ploughing those two wenches." He was right, of course, and I knew I needed to prove myself to my men. The next few days could make or break me as a warrior, and there was every chance I would never return to the village and my girls. The trip south was quite fast as the wind was on our backs. The men rested as the Njord, the god of the winds, was kind to us and hastened our journey. The village we sought was well known by two of my uncle's shipmasters. They told me of an island just up the coast from the village's landing stage, and we all agreed to land there and wait for the right time to take the fight to the Saxons. The trip took 2 days, and we were happy to see the little island. We landed late on the evening and camped on the seaward side of the island. I placed watchmen on the shore side in case the Saxons came to visit. I had the men feast on bread and cheese rather than light any fires. We didn't want to advertise our being there. The following morning I ordered Cleng to man one ship with his best men, and to sail south and to make havoc. I took a ship north, a ship loaded with the 30 youngest of my warriors. They need to be put into battle and get used to the intensity of a fight. We rowed for half a day, and then saw a small inlet. Gudver was steering our ship and Halfdan was on the prow with me. We were dressed for war and armed to the teeth. There was a small beach with 4 or 5 hovels on it. We beached the ship, and I led my men up the foreshore. The shacks were empty. I left 5 men and told them to take the ship out into deeper water and await our return. I took my raiding party up a track into the woods that surround the small village. We walked for an hour before we saw signs of life. In a clearing there was a village of over 20 houses, a smithy and small feasting hall. I ordered my men to get out of sight, and I went forward to see if I could get an idea of the numbers of men. It was hard to count, but there were upwards of 30 men of fighting age milling about the village. There were other men as well, but they didn't look armed. I went back to my men and we planned our attack. I decided to trick them into attacking us. I split my men into 3 groups. One group, commanded by Halfdan, was hidden on the right side of the track around 200 yards out of the settlement. The other group, led by a young warrior called Osgood, was hidden in the woods opposite Halfdan's men. The others, commanded by me, baited the trap by walking up the track toward the village. I told my men not to be quiet. We wanted the Saxons to hear us, and hear us they did. We were only 50 yards away when I heard shouts and then saw the Saxons arming themselves. We stood our ground as 40 to 50 men started to gather on the outskirts of the village. I saw 2 men on horseback ride off and guessed they were off to gather men, perhaps even to ride to see Lord Aldwin and ask him to bring his men to fight us. The men were full of bravado and jeered at us. Seeing a dozen Vikings walking toward them must have seemed like a gift from the gods. Taunts and threats were shouted and weapons rattled against the rims of shields. I called out to my men to be brave and to be strong. For many, this was the first time they had fought in a battle. I called for the men to build a shield wall. Once the wall had been formed, I whispered that they should be ready to run when I told them to. The Saxons soon saw our wall and started to walk toward it. The numbers were worrying, but I knew we could win that day. Their warband was half warriors and half farmers. Some men carried swords, others spears and other farm tools, billhooks and the like. I was happy to see no archers in their number. I let them get halfway down the track before I told the men to run. Our shield wall disbanded and my men ran back down the track toward the sea. The Saxons mocked us, called us cowards and then gave chase. As always happened, some ran faster than others. We had marked a line in the dirt floor of the track, and as we got to it, we turned and formed the wall again. Some farmers got to us first and we dispatched them with ease. By the time the bulk of their force got to our small wall, there were a dozen dead men for them to clamber over. The tide was turning slowly in our favour. I looked up to see the main band of men only 6 yards from us. They hit the wall with a crash of weapon on weapon, shield on shield, and the wall took a step backwards under the pressure. I had a short sword in my hand and was fending off attackers and hoping that my friends Halfdan and Gudver wouldn't leave it much longer to come to our aid. A shout went up and I saw warriors come from the trees into the Saxons' flanks. The fight seemed to last for hours but was probably over in 5 minutes. The bloodletting started. The sound of battle filled the air, the clank of metal on metal, of sword hitting sword, of shield hitting shield, the curses of men as they fought, the moans of the wounded and dying. I broke free of the shield wall and slashed at the neck of man that was using a long spear to try to pierce the shields of my men in the wall. He went to his knee and another hack from my sword took his life. The ground where he fell quickly turned red with his blood. A huge farmer charged me with a billhook. He swung high and I dropped to one knee as the dangerous-looking weapon swooshed over my head. My sword jabbed up into his guts, blood sprayed. He looked at me and as he opened his mouth I slashed at his right hand. The billhook dropped to the floor, the hand still gripping it. The shock on his face lasted for less than a second as I slashed at his throat and he died before he hit the floor. A young warrior rushed me, but he had a bad technique and left himself open. I ran my sword into his guts, pulled it out and slashed across his thighs. He dropped to the floor and before I could swing my sword, I saw a war axe buried into his head, spewing blood everywhere. I looked up and saw one of my young warriors swinging the huge axe toward his next victim. I watched as Osgood took on a warrior and dispatched him with the slash of his sword. It was over in seconds. 40 Saxons lay on the floor, dead or dying. We could see other men running toward the village. We let them go. It was good to let some of the survivors report what they had seen. We had 2 men injured. Neither would die, so after we had plundered the dead I sent them back to the beach with our treasure. We took gold and jewels only. We walked into the village, now deserted. We searched the shacks for gold and found little, so we torched them, throwing burning lanterns into the thatch roofs. A short walk up the track and we came to a T-junction. I decided to lead my men north. It was away from the main village and led us away from the battle horde that Lord Aldwyn kept in and around his village. The idea was to weaken his supporters before they were called to take arms against us. An hour's walk saw us on the top of a small hill above a small hamlet. I sent half my men around its flank to attack from behind. I gave them half an hour and led the charge. There were less than 30 Saxons in the village, men, women and children, and when we charged they ran. They ran into the waiting sword tips of my men who had waited in the woods beyond their shacks. It was not really a fight, more a slaying, as the Saxon men were not ready and not armed for war. The women and children were allowed to leave live. Again we fired the huts. Columns of smoke rose into the air as I took my men further north. It was not long before we came to another settlement. This one was where a ford crossed the wide river. I could see fishing boats tied to posts in the deep water. It was bigger than the last one, and the men of the village were ready for us. 20 warriors and twice as many men at arms met us. Their shield wall was already formed on the lane onto their village. A huge warrior stood in front of the shield wall. He was a man of fortune. His leather tunic looked thick and his sword gleamed from hours of polishing, and his helmet was adorned with 2 wild boar tusks. Our shield walls were 60 feet apart. He took a dozen paces toward me. "Vikings," he called out, "if you don't want to go to your gods today, turn back." "Who are you, Saxon?" I asked as my men formed their own shield wall. "My name is Lord Acwellon, and I am telling you for your own good leave this place." He growled and picked up his huge sword. He swung it with ease. He held the huge weapon in one hand and swung it to the left and right. Any normal man would have been troubled, but this huge man swung it like it weighed nothing. "So, Lord Aquilon, do you fight for Aldwyn?" I asked, stepping forward to get closer to him. "I do fight for the great Lord Aldwyn," he replied. "Why do you ask, boy?" "Then you must die." I screamed and ran at him. He was a big man, with arms festooned with gold arm rings and tattoos. He swung the huge sword as I ran toward him. He was big and strong, but he was slow. I dropped to the floor and used my momentum to carry me under his swing blade. As I passed his legs, I chopped at his legs and heard him scream. I was now behind him. I swung my sword at his huge right shoulder. He turned and ran at me, and I sidestepped and slashed at the backs of his thighs. He danced to his left and then attacked. He unleashed a burst of overhead chops that nearly cracked my shield. 5, 10, 15 times he hammered my limewood shield. My arm shuddered under the relentless attack. I saw splinters flying off my shield as he chopped at it. While he was attacking me, I was finding hard to parry with my short blade. He slowed for a second and I rolled right and scythed at his right ankle. He cried with pain. The pressure of blows on my small, round shield increased. But he was a big man, and the weight of the huge broadsword he wielded took its toll. He paused, and I rolled to my left and hacked at his ankles again. He cursed me and stepped backwards. I stood up and jabbed. He defended. I feigned a move to the left, and he swung high, and as he swung, I stepped right and slashed at his sword arm, opening a deep wound on his upper arm. He cried out and chopped at me, but I dipped under the blade and slashed upwards, catching his wrist. Blood sprayed into the air. There was shouting from both shield walls as our respective men shouted advice and abuse. I danced left and right, and he swung at me. I parred his sword as he tried to slash me in the guts, and the sound of sword on sword rang out over the battlefield. He dropped his guard, and I stabbed into this chest, the leather taking most of the force, but blood oozed from the cut. Most men by now would have dropped to the floor, weakened by the wounds he had received. He was a brute of a warrior, and he stood his ground. He was slowing, but still standing. I felt the blade as it moved the hair on my head as he swung at me again. I dropped to the floor and rolled. I knew that as soon as I had killed him, for kill him I would, his men would rush at me. He slashed his sword at me, and I rolled backwards, eager to be close to my own men. He was a big warrior, but a stupid warrior. He stepped forward and chopped at me. My shield took the brunt of 6 hearty blows, then I dropped again and rolled backwards again. Again he followed me. "You are a Viking turd," he shouted over the din of the fight. "You are a piece of shit, and you are mine for the taking." He chopped again, and my shield split and half of it hit the floor, and I dropped to one knee. He cried out some Saxon battle cry and swung wildly with his sword. As he did so, his stomach was left unguarded. I thrust my short sword in as hard as I could, knowing his leather tunic would be hard to pierce. He grunted and looked down at me. His sword dropped from his grasp, and I knew I had won the fight. I left my sword embedded in his guts and ran full tilt toward the safety of our shield wall. It had been the right thing to do. The men parted to let me through, and when I turned back toward the body of Aquilon, his men were charging past him. He was kneeling, his hands grasping the Viking metal that was buried in his guts, and he looked straight at me and vomited blood. There was no time to waste watching him die. One of my men offered me a spear, and as I took it, I felt the wall around me shudder as the Saxons hit it full pelt. I stood behind the wall and used the spear to great effect. I took the eye of one man. Another fell after the point of the spear took him in the shoulder. I heard Halfdan shouting for them to move forward, and the wall took one step. The Saxons were leaderless and just ran at us. It was easy to pick them off. After another minute, Halfdan called for 2 steps back. The wall moved as one. It was a wise move from Halfdan, as the Saxons were stumbling over their own dead to reach the wall. Men screamed, men cried, men died. The floor was soon slippery with blood. One of my men dropped to his knee in the wall, and I dragged him backwards. The men either side closed up, filling the space. I laughed. All the training had paid off. I took the man's sword and shield and joined the wall at its right flank. I started to move forward, and my men followed. We hacked, we slashed, we chopped, we maimed, we wounded, and we killed. It took no more than 20 minutes before the Saxons all lay dead or dying. I sent 2 men back down the track to look out for more Saxons. I was sure Lord Aquilon would have sent for reinforcements. We had lost 1 man and had 5 injured, but we had done well as these were more warriors that could not join the Saxon warband when we attacked it. I pulled my sword from the Saxon lord's belly and cleaned it on his breeches. His arms had at last 10 gold rings each. I tried to pull them off but could not get them past his giant hands. It took 2 blows with a battle axe to solve that little problem. I took 4 for myself and handed out the others to my men. A good lord always shared his treasure trove. My father taught me that. We entered the village, now abandoned, and I searched for water. There was a well, and I took water, as did many of the men. A good battle can give a man a good thirst. Fish and eels were smoking, and we ate them as we searched the village. There was little of value. We filled our pockets with the few gold coins we found. I sat on a low bench that was next to a huge fire pit, and Halfdan joined me. Our men wandered around either searching for loot or food. I unstrapped my weapons and pulled off my leather tunic. I poured 2 buckets of water from the well over me, washing away the grime and blood that the battle had covered me in. "You and the men did well, Halfdan," I said as he passed me a jug of ale. "You did well yourself, Uthred," he replied, and gulped his own ale. We had been sitting for less than half an hour when the sentries came running into the settlement shouting. They stopped before us. "Master, Saxons are coming, many Saxons," one cried. "How many would you say?" I asked as I stood up. 300, sir," he said, "many on horseback." The tallest building was the feasting hall. I got my men to boost me onto the roof to give me a better view. He was right. I saw around 100 horsemen and twice as many foot soldiers. They were a quarter of a mile away but closing on us quickly. Halfdan and I called the men to order and sent the wounded northwards. I watched as they forded the wide river and headed up the slope on the other side. "Burn the village," I cried, but as I did so, Halfdan shouted to me. I turned to see our wounded men being hunted down by a small band of horsemen. They were fighting back, and in the end that was a gift from the gods, because it gave us a few valuable seconds to think what we should do. We were trapped with Saxons either side of the river, and many of them on horses. There was no way we could run for it. Then I remembered the fishing boats. To the river, men. We all ran for the river. There were a dozen boats, and I chopped the mooring rope of the first and dived into it. I was soon dragging men into the boat. There was room for half a dozen or so men, and when I thought the boat was full, I ordered the men to take up oars and row for the sea. Men used oars, men used their hands to propel us toward the coast and safety. I steered the small boat in the centre of the river. If the Saxons had archers or throwing axes, we would be dead ducks. The Saxons reached the riverbank 5 minutes after we had cast off, and they tried to chase us down the river. We were already in the widest part of the river, and there was no way they could reach us with arrows or axes. After 2 or 3 miles they gave up as the river flowed into an estuary, and we soon saw our ship at anchor. We boarded the ship and towed the fishing boats back to the island. We had done our job, and I hoped Cleng had been as lucky. We had lost some men, but we had put a dent in the enemy's forces. As we sailed back to the island, it started to rain. We could see there was a storm coming, and when we beached the ship, we saw that the other ships had been hauled up the beach as far as they could. Halfdan met me on the beach. I could see Cleng's ship beached further along the foreshore. I ordered campfires to be lit. Let's face it, the Saxons knew we're here now, so there was little point in trying to hide the fact. A little warm food would please the men, I thought to myself. "So, Uthred, was your trip successful?" he asked as we walked in the rain. "It was, my friend. We killed and wounded at least 100 men," I replied, "and lost less than a dozen to injuries and 1 man dead." "Well done, my friend," he said as we walked up the beach. Men were busy building shelters. Spare oars and rigging was being put to good use. The sky was black above us and the rain was coming down harder and faster. I guessed we were in for a rough night. Gudver met us and told us he had climbed to the highest point of our island and has seen a huge storm approaching. It looked like we would have to wait to see what tomorrow brought. A clap of thunder rolled around the sky as we headed toward the main camp. Cleng rose to meet us and we embraced. "So, Cleng, how did the hunt go?" I asked as I helped myself to a mug of water from our drinking barrel. "Good, Uthred. I think we injured and killed at least 80 men," he said. "There were bread and cheese laid out. We both took some food and sat on a fallen tree. I was eager for the cooks to get the fires roaring and food cooking. Cold rations does not fill the bellies of fighting men." Cleng told me about his trip to seek out the Saxons, and I told him about mine, if we had taken 180 men out of action, that made the fight more even. After eating, I went to one of the streams and washed off the grime of war. The water was cold and refreshing. I washed off the blood and sweat and tried to work out my plan of action. Later that evening, I called a council of war, and the senior warriors came to sit and discuss our next move. We had moved into a bigger tent that had been raised using spare masts and sails. The air was thick with smoke and the rain dripped off the sides. It was decided that we would make some more trips onto the mainland when the storm had passed. There was little to do now but rest and prepare for war. We ate, drank, and some men sharpened weapons. The storm hit us hard. More and more thunder rolled around the island and lightning lit up the sky. The rain made new streams in the earth. So we slept. There was little more to do than sleep. The morning came and the storm was still all around us. There would be no fighting today, I thought, as I stepped out of the tent and pissed up a rock. Men don't like to fight in a storm. The rain can make it hard to get a good footing. A good footing is essential in battle. I saw Cleng walking up from the beach. His sea cloak was dripping wet and his hair and beard were plastered to his skin. "Cleng, is all well?" I shouted over the sound of the wind. "Yes, Uthred. The ships are drawn well up the beach and tied well," he shouted back. We walked back to the huge tent that had become my feasting hall and meeting place. I called my trusted warriors to the tent. Meat, bread and cheese were laid out for us and water and beer barrels opened. Most of the men agreed that the day should be spent preparing as it was not good weather for a battle. The day drifted past and the storm did not abate. The tempest lasted for another 2 days, and even then the sky was still full of rain. On the 4th day, the winds dropped and the seas looked calmer. We decided to wait for one more day. I was sat in my tent when a cry went up from the lookouts on the hill. A boat was approaching the island. Men armed themselves and ran to the longboats. I ran to the hill. The lookouts pointed out a small boat that was about to beach itself on the landward side of our island. 3 men left the boat and headed toward us. They looked like Saxons, but I could not tell if they were armed or not, for the distance was too far to see them clearly. One of the lookouts suggested they might be spies, and I agreed with him. What other reason would the Saxons have for coming to this island? There was a natural pathway through the trees, and the Saxons started to walk up in our direction. If they were spies, they were not being very discreet. Halfdan joined me on top of the hill, as did Osgood. I called for another 3 men and we ran toward the Saxons. We needed to kill the spies. We ran down the hill and into the trees at its base. We found a great place for an ambush, and I hid half of us on either side on the path. We heard them before we saw them. They came around a bend. They were not men but boys, and one of them I knew. It was Jaron. I called out and told my men not to attack. I stepped out of the trees and the boys nearly shit themselves. "Lord Uthred!" Jaroon cried out as I appeared in front of him. All of the boys dropped to their knees before us. I held out my hand and pulled Jaroon to his feet. "I thought you were dead, Jaroon," I told him. "I nearly was, master," he replied, a huge smile cracking his face. "And Lucille, what happened to her?" I asked. "Master, we were cut off from the main body of men when the Saxon army attacked," I told me. His head bowed. "We did not run, master. We shot arrows until our quivers were empty." He was obviously worried I might accuse him of cowardice, but he was no more than a boy, and to be fair to him, I also got left behind during that battle. Sometimes it was better to live to fight another day. "Jaroon, I don't doubt you tried," I said, slapping gently on the back. "Thank you, master. As for Lucille, she is alive and well and enslaved in a Saxon lord's kitchen," he said. "Then we should go and release her," I told him. I was eager to see the girl again. "I have news for you, Lord Uthred," "The Saxons have a trap awaiting you," he replied. It was decided to go back to the camp to hear young Jarun's tale. He and his two friends, who turned out to be young Celts, Kialif and Yanto, who had been taken from Wales as slaves, came back to our camp, and after gathering my trusted men, Jarun told us his story. It seemed this Saxon lord was cleverer than we gave him credit for, and he had amassed a second army, made up only of bowmen, and had made them camp 5 miles inland. There was apparently a valley that sheltered them, and they were well hidden there. Jarun had been serving food during a council of war, and had overheard the Saxons talking about it. They planned to bring their warriors, horsemen and foot soldiers to the beach. They would mock us and tempt us onto the beach. Once we had landed, they would retreat, knowing that we would give chase, and then from the tree line their second army of over 50 archers would let rip their sky-born terror. A group of 50 archers would be able to unleash huge numbers of arrows, and there would be little doubt that they would weaken our numbers. It was known that Vikings hate bowmen. Real fighting was done hand to hand, chest to chest. Fighting from afar was not the way real men fight. This new news was a worry, as there was no way we could win if the archers rained their barbed shafts onto us. I took off a gold arm ring and used a sword to cut it into 2 halves. One half was given to Jarun, the other was halved again and given to the other 2 lads. The boys were sent from the tent. Halfdan and Kleng wanted to attack now and surprise the Saxons. Gudver thought we should send for more ships and try to outnumber them. I knew that no matter how many ships full of warriors we had, the Saxons with 50 archers would kill us before we had a chance to meet them face to face. I seemed to me that Lord Aldwin had a warrior's brain, and a good tactical brain at that. We had to get to the archers and put them to the sword before the Saxons had a chance to call upon their services. I decided that I needed to do a little spying of my own to see what could be done to get rid of these bastard archers. I told my senior men that I was going to the mainland that night to check out the situation. We would use one of the small fishing boats. The Saxons would have lookouts looking for longboats full of men, and, I hoped and prayed to Odin, they would miss a smaller vessel. We headed across the small stretch of water to the mainland as midnight approached. It took nearly 2 hours to sail the small boat into a small cove and to hide her, as we would need her for the trip back. I didn't want the Saxon spies to see us land. Jarun, Osgood and I had brought dark sea cloaks, and we covered ourselves as we quickly ran up the beach and the trees. Once we got into cover, we hunkered down and waited to see if we had been spotted. We saw small bands of mounted Saxons patrolling the foreshore, but they had missed us landing. After an hour, I decided it was time to move inland. I told Jarun to lead us to the valley where the bowmen were hiding. He told me the village of the lord that had enslaved Lucille was on the way, so we decided to go there first. The night was dark, there was no moonlight, and the sounds of the darkness surrounded us. We felt bats whooshing around us, heard owls hooting to each other, and heard the movement of animals as they moved away from us as they heard us. Jarun guided us through the woods and up over a small hill. We had to hide at one point as we saw a group of 20 men riding past us. They were only 3 swords' lengths from us, but the darkness of the night hid us well. We had to skirt 2 villages so that the village guards and their dogs did not sense us. The journey took longer than I would have hoped, as we had to tread carefully. We came to a dense copse as the sun was rising to brighten the sky, so we buried ourselves in the deepest part of the thicket. We had brought water and dry rations with us. We ate and then took it in turns keep watch while the other 2 slept. The day's sun rose and started to fall. I had been sleeping, and Osgood awoke me. It would be dark enough to travel in an hour or so. We ate and finished off our water. Jarun was eager to move on straight away, but we waited until the darkness would totally envelop us. We moved on with caution. Jarun was sure that the village where Lucille was enslaved was only a mile from where we had camped for the night. He was not wrong. We saw the village in the distance and edged our way nearer. We could see a feasting hall, some small shacks and a small stable. We saw 2 men wandering around the village. They were the lookouts, but they were not doing a good job. There was a small shack set back in the woods beyond the village. Jarun pointed it out to me. "That's the slave hut, master," he told me. "There is something wrong here," I whispered. Jaren and Osgood both looked at me as if I had gone mad. I stared down into the village. I sensed something. I was not sure what, but something was odd about the village. "Master Uthred, what is wrong?" asked Osgood. I waited at least 5 minutes before I replied. "Look around, the stable block is empty, there are no horses and no carts," I said, "and there are no fires in the village." We all looked at the village. Even at night there should be smoke coming from fires in the main hall and the shacks. I guessed that the village was empty. There was only one way to find out. "Osgood, you sneak around the left and I will take the right," I told him. "Jaren, give us to the count of 100 and then walk into the village." "But master," he started to say, but I stopped him. "It is fine when the guards see you. We will sneak up behind and deal with them," I said. Osgood nodded his understanding, and we head into the woods to outflank the guards. I managed to get behind one of the shacks and awaited Jarun's arrival. As I had predicted, as Jarun walked into the village, the guards ran toward him and ignored everything but him. Osgood and I were behind the guards with sword tips digging into their flesh before they knew what was happening. Osgood took a man into the hut and tied him up. I took mine to the centre of the village. I sat him down and asked his name. He told me he was called Erd and was only doing his duty. He was young and scared, and he was eager to talk. "So, Erd, where are the villagers?" I asked in my most threatening voice. "They have gone to fight the Vikings. Lord Aldwin has called in all the villagers from all around," he said. "So who is left in the village?" I demanded. "Just me and the other guard, Drefan," he said, "and there are 6 slaves." Osgood went to question the other Saxon, and he came back and nodded to me, telling me the other guard had said the same. I had the other man brought out of the shack, and while Osgood guarded them, I checked every building in case it was a trap. They were all empty. They looked abandoned. We took the 2 guards into the woods and killed them. They could not be allowed to leave, as they would bring back more Saxons, and we had no time for prisoners. Then we went to the slave hut. There were 6 cages. Lucille was in the first, and she called out my name as I approached her. I used my sword to hack away the bindings that held the door shut. She ran into my arms and hugged me. "Master Uthred, you came for me," she said as she kissed me hard on the lips. "That I did, girl. Now, are the other slaves Saxon?" I asked of her. "No, master. 2 are Viking and there are 3 Celts," she told me. "Right, slaves, listen to me. I am Uthred, and I am here to fight the Lord Aldwin, and you can either fight with me or you can walk away," I said. "But if you fight with me, I will make you rich, free men." All of the men agreed that wanted to fight the Saxons. We released them, and we headed to the feasting hall. Jarun and Lucille lit lamps and got the fire going. The Viking men told me they had been captured 6 months ago when their master's ship had grounded near Lord Aldwin's village, and his men had killed all of the crew but them. The Celts had been sold to the Saxons as slaves. They all agreed to fight with me to defeat the Saxon lord. We found some weapons and armed the slaves. The Celts told me they are happier with a bow than a spear, but there were no bows to be had. I gave Lucille a sharp knife and spear. The hall had a storeroom, and in there we found beer and food. We soon had meat roasting. One of the Vikings told me that there was a band of archers in a hamlet 1 mile from where we were. This confirmed Jarun's story. I decided to wait until dawn, and then go to see this band of bowmen for myself. Lucille slept in my arms that night. The 2 Viking slaves took turns as a lookout in case any Saxons should pass by. The Vikings I could trust. The Celts would need to earn my trust and respect. The morning broke as we ate a breakfast of bread and cheese. I left Osgood with the slaves, and Jaren took me to the archers' hamlet. We took up position on the small hill which was upwind of the camp. The hamlet was basically 2 thatched halls and a store that was open-sided, and we could see 2 carts that were loaded with quivers and one with spare bows. There must have been over 2,000 arrows in those 2 carts. The men were walking around, fires were being used to cook, and 3 men that were obviously fetchers sat on one side of the fire making arrows. I had counted between 45 and 50 men. If they were all archers, they would cut us down like lambs to the slaughter. We headed back to the village. As we walked, I laid out my plans in my head. Once back in the hall, I told everyone my ideas. Basically, that evening I would send the 2 Vikings, Hjort and Oikel, to keep watch over the village of archers. They would come back to me if the archers started to move on. Jarun and Osgood would take the Celts with them to take my plans to Halfdan, Kleng, and Gudver. I wanted the attack to start early in the morning in 2 days. That would give me time to sort out the archers. Jarun would bring back a few men. I guessed that I would need 12 plus Jarun and the 3 Celts. If they were good archers, we could make use of them. We ate roasted meat that evening, and when darkness enveloped the village, the 2 groups of men left to do their duty. I watched them go and then closed the door, lowering the big locking bar. I didn't want any Saxons walking in on us. We dampened the fire and extinguished the lamps, as there was no reason to advertise the fact we were there. It took only a few moments for our eyes to become accustomed to the darkness in the hall. Lucille was dressed in a slave's smock and looked at me with a knowing smile. I took off my weapons but laid them close to hand. I slipped off my boots, tunic and trousers. I was as naked as the day I was born. "Master," Lucille said. It was almost a whisper. "Why don't you lie down and rest for a while?" I lay back on a bed of animal hides. Lucille stood in front of me and slid her smock to the floor. She stood naked, and even in the darkness, I could make out her large, firm tits, her strong legs, and the shadow of pubic hair between her legs. My cock twitched. She knelt beside her, and her soft fingers wrapped around my semi-erect dick. She began stroking my shaft, her fingers encircling the head of my cock with each upward stroke of her hand. Her head was close to my dick, as I could feel her breath on it as she slowly wanked me off. Her hand moved expertly up and down my cock, slowly but firm movements. My cock was now rock hard, and I could hear Lucille making little noises as she stroked it up and down, up and down. My master, Uthred. You have such a nice big cock." She giggled as she slid a hand under my hairy balls. Slowly and firmly she wanked me. My hips began rocking involuntarily, moving in time to the strokes of her hand on my cock. I felt her shift, and then the amazing sensation as her lips slid over my cock's crown. I gasped and she moaned. She took its full length into her mouth, and then slid her slips back up to its crown, slowly, so very slowly. She let my cock slip from her mouth and licked around the rim of its mushroom-shaped crown as she fondled my balls. Her touch was delicate and erotic. I could hear my heart drumming in my chest as she sucked on my dick. She licked, kissed and slurped at my dick's head for a few minutes before kissing and licking her way down my shaft until her lips were at my balls. She sucked each one into her mouth in turn before showering my tight ball bag in a flurry of kisses. Her hand was on my cock, stroking, fondling and wanking. Her kisses felt so good on my balls. She stroked then on her cheeks. She ran the tip of her tongue up the shaft of my cock, and then opened her mouth and sucked my erection into her mouth. Lucille dragged her lips up and down my shaft. Slowly and deliberately, she sucked my erection. My fingers played with my bollocks as she sucked up and down my cock, her tongue working on it at the same time. I started to moan as Lucille licked and sucked my cock. My balls tightened, and I knew I would not be able to hold back. She must have sensed my urgency and started to bob her head up and down, taking my cock deep into her mouth. I could feel her tongue lapping at my shaft. I grabbed her head and started thrusting my dick in and out of her mouth. Lucille moaned in approval as she allowed my cock to slide rapidly in and out of her wet mouth. I face-fucked her for 5 minutes, but the pleasure was too much. I knew I was closing to shooting and let out a low-groaned warning to Lucille. She slid her lips up so they held my cock's head just inside her mouth and wrapped her fingers around the base of my cock. She started to wank me fast and hard, wanking me into her mouth, warm, willing mouth. I let out a grunt and felt a string of cum fire from my cock, and that was followed by 3 more. I felt Lucille swallow my gooey seed, and then she let out a little giggle. "Your cum is very tasty indeed, Lord Uthred," she giggled as she licked her lips. I felt her move upwards toward me, and then the warmth of her big boob on my face. I sucked on the warm, firm flesh of her tit, and I took her nipples into my mouth one at a time and sucked and nibbled on them. My hands fondled her heavy orbs, massaging the firm, warm flesh. I rolled her over so she was on her back and I slid down her body. I kissed and suckled on her amazing boobs, kissed over her stomach until I reached the top of her hairy pussy. I used my fingers to open her lips wide and thrust my tongue deep into her wet pussy. She tasted good, and I lapped at her for a few minutes, gorging myself on her syrupy, thick juices. I moved up and took her clit into my mouth. At the same time, I slid 2 fingers deep into her love tunnel. She gasped as they slid in and out of her tight little hole. At the same time, I started to flick and lick her clit as fast as I could. I felt her hand on the back of my head as I alternated between licking her clit and eating her cunt. My face was soon sticky with her love juice, and Lucille was moaning and groaning. She called out to her god and called out to me if I slowed down. She called me a bastard, a fucker, and I ate her harder and harder. Her hips started to drive up at me as I took her labia between my lips and sucked and pulled on them. Her moans became louder. Lucille's body started to tense and her breathing became more laboured, and I knew she was near to climax. I started to work on her clit, and at the same time slid 3 fingers into her soaking wet pussy. She shuddered and I felt her pussy clench my fingers. At the same time my hand was soaked as her juices flooded stronger and faster. Her groans filled my ears as she started to shudder harder as her body was overwhelmed by her orgasm. I flicked and sucked on her clit even harder as she rode out the explosion of passion that flooded her body. I felt her shake and shudder. I heard her moans and groans and I kept licking her. My fingers felt both hot and wet, buried as they were deep in her pussy. I started to seesaw them in and out of her wet cunt, and I heard Lucille moan out. "Oh, master, master, that's good," she groaned as I finger-fucked her harder and deeper. She was close to another climax. I dipped my head and took her clit between my lips and sucked it hard, and at the same time, I used the tip of my tongue to massage it. Her second orgasm was stronger and harder than the first, and she moaned and groaned so loudly, I was sure the Saxons in the next village would hear her. We lay on our backs on the makeshift bed. Lucille cuddled up to me, her head on my chest. "Uthred, will you take me back to your village after the great battle?" she whispered. I had almost forgotten the great battle that was to come. At the same time, I thought about Rosie and Matilda, who were already back at my father's village. "Yes, Lucille, yes, I will," I said, not sure if I was telling a lie or not. After a few minutes, I felt her hand on my cock. She stroked the soft flesh until it started to stiffen. Then she slipped down and took me into her mouth, sucking on me until I was rock hard. "Oh, Lord Uthred, I can't wait any longer. Fuck me now, please, master," she growled. "Please, master." So I gently pushed her back on the bed. Her arse was on the edge of the bed as I lifted her legs and spread them wide. I looked down at her hairy bush and told her to open it wide for me. She spread her lips open with one hand as she guided my stiff cock to it with the other. She was tight and I loved the feeling as my cock's crown buried itself deep into her. My hips drove my cock as deep as I could go. Then I pulled back until my cock's tip rested on her pussy and drove back into her. 3 or 4 times I pulled all the way out before burying my cock deep into her. Each time I entered her, she let out a little whimper. I lifted her legs up onto my shoulders and grabbed her hips and started to fuck her with deep, hard strokes. I watched as her tits rolled about her chest as I fucked her. Her face was a picture of contentment as I fucked her, driving my dick in and out of her wet quim. I was soon rocking back and forth as I drove into her. As I drove my erection into her, I felt my balls bouncing off her cuirass. I could feel her pussy working at my cock, its muscles tensing and untensing around my shaft, almost milking the cum from my balls. I leaned forward and grabbed a fistful of her rolling breast and began to gently squeeze and fondle as I slowly fucked in and out of her tight cunt. Lucille was breathing hard now, and my own breath was just as laboured. I felt that familiar feeling in the pit of my stomach and my balls began to tighten. I began pounding into her tight, juicy hole as she squirmed and bucked beneath me. We were both moaning and groaning now, and I knew I would not last long. I heard her scream my name and her body went limp, and at the same time my hips drove me deep and I felt my cock swell, and then my balls emptied themselves into her. String after string of my seed exploded from my cock into her womb. I kept driving until my cock went flaccid, and then I rolled off Lucille and lay back on the bed. A noise woke me. It was Lucille moving around. She was making breakfast. I dressed and went outside for a piss. The dawn was just breaking. I stood still and listened for a while, but the village was as still as the dead. I slapped Lucille's arse as I went back into the hall. She giggled and called me an oaf. We ate breakfast and washed it down with cold water from the village's well. The men returned as the sun broke through the dawn sky. We heard them coming before we saw them as they called out my name as they approached. I grabbed my short sword and headed out into the centre of the village. Jarun and Osgood were soon walking into the village. They had the 5 Celts with them, Sialif and Yanto. As well as them, they had the 3 Celts we had released from the slave hut. I found out their names were Conin, Dafydd and Eden. Plus, there was a handful of my own crew. That made a nice little war band. I asked Jarun to go and get Hjort and Oikel from their look outposts at the archers' village. The Celts were all armed with spears and they had brought spare swords and shields with them. At midday, I sat the men down and talked through my plan. It was a simple plan. We would attack the village at midnight. We would kill the guards and burn the halls. A hall burning was a Viking tradition, and if done right, we could kill most of the 50 archers while they slept. The men slept that afternoon, and that evening we feasted on food stolen from the Saxon lord's larder. I drew a map of the village in the dirty with the tip of a spear. Each of the men was given a task, as was Lucille. If we all did as I planned, it would be easy to take the village. So as darkness fell about us, we started to move out to the archers' hamlet. I took the lead and saw that only 4 guards patrolled the village. I took out 1 and Osgood and Hjort took care of the other 3. Once we had the guards taken care of, I called the Celts down to the barn. They had the pick of the bows and took a couple of quills of arrows each. I told them to prepare arrows with shreds of cloths wrapped around them. At the same time, I told Lucille to make some torches and stack them by the fire pit in the centre of the hamlet. She used some small branches to make up 24 torches. Each had one end wrapped in cloth ready to set fire to. As they did that, I and the other men took hay bales and placed them around the sides and back of the 2 huts. We placed 5 or 6 in front of the doors of the hall. With 4 well-armed Viking warriors in front of each door, Osgood, Jarun and I took up torches and set the bales alight, first the ones at the doors and then the rests. At the same time, the archers started to fire burning arrows onto the thatched roofs. It didn't take long for the halls to start burning well, and 10 minutes after the first flame had touched hay, the archers inside started to shout. The front doors were well ablaze, and I heard men hammering at the sides of the halls. On the right-hand hut, I saw the panel of the wall being smashed out, and 4 men ran out, their hair alight, small daggers or eating knives in their hands. The warriors moved toward them, but they all fell under a volley of arrows from the Celtic archers. More men tried to get out of the burning building, but the Celts did their job well, and proved to me that they knew how to use a bow all right. As I watched them cut down any men that tried to run from the building, my nose was filled with the smell of burning flesh. There was a crash as the roof trusses of the left-hand hall fell in, and a whoosh as more air spurred on the flames. No men made it out of that left-hand hut alive. We stood for an hour or more watching the halls burn. There could be no man left alive in either of them. We had stopped the archers before they had a chance to kill us, and had done a little to even up the fight ahead. I went around the little hamlet. The 2 carts laden with arrows would be of use. I called the Celts to me and told them to take what bows they needed. Each took 4 or 5 spares, as did Jarun and Lucille. They both knew how to use the bow, but I guessed not as good as the Celts. There were some horses in a paddock, and we used them to pull the 2 carts of arrows. The other cart was burned. There was no point leaving any weapons for the Saxon bastards to use, and we could not take it with us. So we made our way up the track, out the village. I looked back a few times, but there was nothing but smoke and flames to see. It might attract Saxon attention, but there was little I could do about that now. I sent Jarun and Osgood ahead of us to keep a good watch. The going was slow, and I was worried that we would not get to the beach in time. We walked for a few hours, and then came across another deserted village. This one had no guards. We camped there for the evening, and as night fell, Jarun and I scouted the land ahead of us. We were only half an hour's walk from the beach that looked out over our little island. There was a steep cliff down to the beach. It was an ideal place to launch our attack. We walked its length. There was a small pathway down to the beach, wide enough for one man at a time. Nice and easy to defend. As we walked back to our camp, I heard the sound of a horse. It was moving along the track at pace. We hid in some bushes and Jarun took aim with his bow. His first arrow missed, but his second took the man in the shoulder and he fell off the horse a few yards from us. I ran out onto the track and slid my sword from its sheath. "So, Saxon, where are you going so fast?" I asked. At first he was not eager to answer, but when the tip of my sword bit into his flesh he decided to tell me. "I am to get the archers, to bring them here as the battle starts tomorrow at dawn," he said. "They are to hide until they hear the great drum being beaten." So now I knew their plans, and I killed the Saxon as he was no longer any use to me. We dumped his body in the shrub at the side of the track and headed back to the camp. We ate well that night, as it could be our last meal. We took his horse and tied it with the other 4 we had. I slept with Lucille in my arms and she told me she loved me. I told her to sleep as tomorrow would be a long, hard day. We awoke before dawn and pushed the carts as close to the cliff as we could, then carried the quivers of arrows the rest of the way. Soon there were 7 piles, 1 for each of the Celts and 1 each for Jarun and Lucille. Some spare bows were stacked there as well, as once they started firing there would be no time to replace a broken bowstring. We sat back from the edge of the cliff and watched as dawn broke over the beach. The sight on the beach was amazing. There was a shield wall that must have been 6 men deep and 100 men wide. Behind that, there were more men, spearmen ready to throw over the wall. Behind them, there were around 100 mounted men. Osgood and I guessed their number at well over 1,000 men. Our forces on the island were well outnumbered. We had started out with 300 but had lost some in our skirmishes. As I pondered that thought, I saw the dragon-headed longboats being rowed around the tip of the island. The sea had calmed and the boats came toward the shore at a good speed. Whatever I was going to do, I needed to do quickly. We now had 5 horses, so I took Lucille, Jarun, Hjort, and Oikel with me. We cantered off toward the Lord Aldwin's village. We stopped on high ground about half a mile from the village. We could see his armies on the beach another half a mile from the village. From the noise they were making, it was obvious that our Viking brothers had landed. We needed to act and act fast. There was a smithy on the edge of the village. I could see its fires burning and a huge plume of smoke in the still morning air. The fire had worked once for us. I wondered if it would work again. Just past next to that was a slave cage. We could see a dozen or so men in the cages. The timing had to be right. I told Lucille to go back to the cliff, and when they saw Saxons heading back to their village, they should start to fire at them. I took her bow from her before she left, as well as her quill of arrows. We discounted and left the horses tied to a tree. I hoped we could sneak into the village. It seemed most of the people left there were watching the action on the beach. We made it to the smithy. There was a Saxon on fire watch, but he was soon dispatched to his god by Oikel and his sword. We took the arrows we had, 2 quivers, so around 100 arrows, and using scraps of cloth made them into torches. As we did that, Oikel released the slaves. There were 4 Celts, 4 young Viking warriors, and 4 men with dark skin that spoke a language I didn't understand. Oikel offered them the choice to fight with us or to run to safety. All of the Viking and 2 of the Celts were with us. The others ran off up the track toward the hills. Oikel armed the men with weapons that he found in the smithy. Some had swords, others had spears. Jarun and I stood either side of the smithy, and Oikel and Hjort passed us burning arrows which we fired into the village. Jarun was much faster and more accurate than I was. It didn't take long for the thatched huts to start to smoulder, and 10 minutes after the last arrow was sent flying, there were thick plumes of smoke meandering into the sky. When the arrows were gone, I told Jarun to climb to the roof of the smithy and watch the beach, to shout when any of the Saxon armies came toward us. The time for arrows was gone. Now it was time for the sword, the spear and the axe to do their work. We hunted as a pack. I kicked in the door of the first hut I came to, and 3 women looked up at me as they were sat around a small fire. I put them to the sword and kicked the fire around, lighting up the hut. As I stepped out into the daylight, I could see the men creating havoc all around me. It was a pure slaughter. It was the only way. We hacked, we stabbed. and we set light to all we could see. We had to make a diversion. I smashed into another hut. 2 old men ran at me with short swords. They were too old for the battle, but old enough to fight. I parried some good blows away before the first man dropped his guard, and I slashed his face with the sharp tip of my sword. He dropped to his knees. The second man stepped over him and swung at my head. I dropped to a knee and slashed it across his thighs. Blood sprayed as he screamed. His sword arm dropped and I slashed at his throat. He dropped to the earth and I stepped out of the hut. A young girl ran at me with a spear. She lunged, and as she did, I knocked the spear from her hands and ran my sword into her guts. The village was now full of smoke and full of screaming. I saw a Saxon knock one of the freed Celtic slaves to the earth and pierce his stomach with a pitchfork. I ran at the Saxon. My blade crashed into his neck. He was dead seconds later. The rest of the men fought well. We killed, we injured, we maimed. My eyes stung with the smoke that was drifting from the burning buildings. 3 young Saxon lads ran around the side of a hut armed with swords. The first ran straight into me and was dead before he knew what was happening. The other 2 ran at me as one. I raised my small round shield and parried a blow. At the same time, I hacked at the other Saxon. One of them backed off. The other hacked at my shield. I raised my shield higher and he hacked at it again, but left his body unguarded. I slashed his stomach and he screamed. His friend ran to his aid. I slammed the shield into his face and he dropped to his knees. It took 3 more thrusts from my sword to send both of the men to their graves. I heard Jeroen shouting over the sound of our melee. "Uthred! Uthred, the horsemen are coming!" he shouted at the top of his voice. I called out for him to run to the horses. Another Saxon ran at me, armed with only a fishing spear. I sidestepped and chopped at his leading arm. It dropped to the floor, followed quickly by the Saxon himself. It was time to go. I called out to the men to run. I ran between 2 burning huts. Oikel was in front of me. When I got to the horses, I jumped on mine and looked across the field toward the village. Jort was coming, as were one of the Celts and 3 of the Vikings we had released from the slave cage. We pulled the men onto the horses and spurred the horses into a gallop. We could hear the shouts of the Saxons as they gave chase. After a few minutes, I looked back and saw 24 horse-mounted warriors still giving chase. We rounded a corner and I called at the men to dismount. We slapped the rumps of the horses and they ran off down the track. We ran into the woods at the side of the track and watched as the Saxons rode on past us. It took less than half an hour to make it back to the cliff. The Celtic bowmen were working hard, and when I looked out over the beach, I saw a battle playing out before me. The Saxon shield wall and the Viking shield wall were only 50 paces apart. I could see throwing axes and spears hurtling through the sky. My men had created a small shield wall at the base of the cliff to guard the pathway up it, and a band of Saxon spearmen was charging it. They were desperate to get to the archers. When I looked past them, I saw why. The beach was full of dead men and rider-less horses. The bowmen had taken out as many of the Saxons as they could when they turned back toward the village. They had followed my orders well. I could not see Lucille. I called out to Jeroen as he unleashed another arrow onto the beach, and he told me she was on the cliff behind the shield wall. I looked down. She was firing arrows into the spearmen. The small shield wall was outnumbered, and I called the band of men that had been in the village to strengthen it. We ran down the path and attacked the Saxons on the left flank. We gave the men in the shield wall the impetus to move forward. We hacked at them. But it's hard to get past a spear with a sword, and so as soon as I could, I grabbed a spear from a fallen Saxon and sheathed my sword. I was now able to jab at them. The first row of spearmen, always the most eager fighters, were sent to their graves. The others, seeing their comrades dying, found they had no stomach for the fight and ran. I heard Lucille screaming at the top of her voice. "Archers! Archers! The horses!" she cried out to the men at the top of the cliff. I looked up and saw 50 men on horses cantering across the beach toward us. They were less than 200 paces away. "Shield wall! Shield wall!" I shouted above the din of the battle. 50 horsemen were far too many for us to fight. Their big stallions would smash through the wall with ease. The wall formed, and I took my place in the second row. My small shield was not right for the front row. The horsemen were now a mere 100 paces away. Then I heard the swoosh, swoosh, swoosh as arrows came raining down from the cliff, like a swarm of wasps above us. A good bowman can have his third or fourth arrow on the bow before his first found its target. We saw horses fall. We saw Saxons drop to the ground, only be trampled on by the horses following behind. Within seconds, the 50 horsemen were whittled down to 10, and they rode away from us. Rode away from the barrage of arrows that fell from the sky and killed all before it. The shield wall broke, and the men went about the work of dispatching any wounded Saxons they could find. I ran back up to the top of the cliff. The shield walls were now face to face, and the battle was in full fling. As I watched, the Viking shield wall shuddered and took a step backwards. I could see the flash of swords blades and axe heads as the front rows of the shield walls fought their own private battle with each other. We need to go to their aid as they were still well outnumbered. I called the bowmen to take as many as quivers they could carry and go to the beach. I headed down. Lucille followed me down, and I called my small war band to me. We had to attack the Saxon rear ranks. We ran across the beach unnoticed by the men in the wall. We set up our shield wall some 100 paces from the back row of the Saxon shield wall. We could hear them grunting and the shouts and screams of war. The archers stood 20 paces behind us, and at my command, they fired into the back of the shield wall. Wave after wave of arrows flew over my head, and I saw countless men drop to the earth. It didn't take long before a group of Saxons realised what was happening and turned and ran straight at us. The first group of a dozen were slain with ease. Soon our little shield wall had a wall of dead and dying Saxons in front of it. Our archers fired volley after volley of arrows, and it was hard for them to miss. More men stopped pushing at the wall, and seeing the dead and dying, arrows protruding from them, turned to face us. We fought well, we fought hard. When the arrows ran out, the Celtic bowmen grabbed weapons from dead Saxons and fought in the wall. A huge Saxon warrior charged our wall with 20 men. He smashed into the shield of Osgood and made him take a step backwards. The Saxon's ribs were an open target to me, and I stabbed into him. He fell to his knees, and Osgood used a war axe to cave in his head. A spearman rammed his spear into my shield. I dropped my shield arm, taking his spear with it, and slashed at him with my sword, and its tip ripping in his cheek. His hands went to his face, and my sword punctured his guts. I saw one of the young Viking, whose name I didn't know, fall to the ground, a spear in his chest. One of the Celts stepped over him, pick up his shield, taking his place in the wall. In front of us, men were dying. I ordered the wall to take 6 paces forward. We stepped over dead and dying men and awaited the next onslaught. I heard a scream from behind me and saw Lucille, an axe in her hands, killing the wounded Saxons. 10 more men ran at us, but our wall held firm and our swords sent them to the floor. I looked up and saw the Saxons starting to retreat. They were running back up the beach. It was total mayhem. I called for our wall to run. We headed back to the cliffs. Saxons were running past us, around us, either too scared or too stupid to notice us. When we got to the cliff, I sent the Celts back up to start using their bows again, and I formed a wall at the top of the footpath. The Saxons were trying to form a wall again further up the beach, but most of the warriors had fallen and the men-at-arms were not keen to fight on. We saw bands of men stream back toward the village, some headed under the cliffs, running south down the beach. I soon heard the swooshing of arrows and twanging of bowstrings as the remaining bowmen let loose their shafts. The main body of the Viking wall was now marching one step at a time up the beach. Some Saxons tried to get to the archers that were cutting their kinsmen down by charging our wall. They were cut down one by one. I lost my sword in the belly of a spear-wielding Saxon. There wasn't time to retrieve it. I saw a long-handled war axe in the sand. I took it and hammered the shield of a Saxon that was trying to gut me with his spear. His shide shattered as my third blow hit it and the axe blade sank into his arm. He dropped, and one of the Celts disemboweled him with a spear. I stepped over the dead man and swung the mighty axe another Saxon. The axe head buried deep into his shoulder and blood sprayed into my face. The man died as the axe swung again and buried into his chest. Blood seeped from between his lips as he dropped to the sand. I watched Osgood fighting 2 men, both armed with daggers. He made short work of them. They hit the floor within seconds of each other. His axe was dripping with blood. The wall reformed and stepped forward. I saw my short sword and, using my foot to hold down the dead Saxon, pulled it from his guts. I called Osgood to me and saw he was bleeding from a cut on his upper arm. "Come with me," I shouted over the ruckus at Shield Wall. We ran back up the path to get a better view of the beach and watched as Lucille carried quivers from the carts down the track, back toward the archers. The archers worked hard that day. They fired their arrows until their fingers bled. They fired wave after wave of their arrows into the Saxons on the beach, and they killed men. They wounded men. I heard a scream from the track and called for Osgood to follow me. I ran, and as I got to the carts saw a dozen Saxons. Lucille was on the floor, a spear in her chest, blood bubbling from her mouth as she screamed. The man holding that spear was still upright as my sword took his head off his shoulders. The man behind him slashed at me with a billhook and I chopped his wrist off. He screamed and dropped to the floor. I saw Osgood to my right kill a man with a single blow of his axe. Another man ran at him and he used his shield to swat him to the floor and then buried the huge axe head in his stomach. The screaming of the man filled my ears. Two Saxons ran at me, short swords in their hands. I sidestepped and battered one in the head with my shield. He stumbled long enough for me to slash his friend across the chest, and then when he got to his feet, my blade pierced his throat. Another Saxon, a spear in his hands, ran at me, his spear pointing at my chest. I raised my shield and it took the blow. The Saxon rammed it home and I swung my blade under the sword. It hit flesh, and the man screamed out in pain. I felt the pressure on my shield drop and I thrust my sword into his face. He screamed out again and dropped to his knees. A swipe of my sword across the back of his neck killed him. I looked to my left. Osgood was fighting two men, both big, brawny men, one with an axe that was hammering into Osgood's shield, the other with a billhook. I ran to his aid and skewered the axeman. It took Osgood seconds to kill the other Saxon. 12 dead men lay around us. I punched Osgood on his good arm. "That was some fight, my friend," I said. At the same time, I saw Lucille, the spear still upright in her chest. I ran to her and pulled the spear from its wound and tossed it aside. I knelt beside her, but she was gone. I felt anger and hatred like I had never felt before. She had been a great lover and a great fighter. I closed her eyes and kissed her forehead. There are times for sentiment, but not in the middle of a battle. We ran back to the cliff top. The Saxons were much smaller in number now, in part down to the murderous arrows that were being sent amongst them, and in part down to the Viking wall that was now fighting hand to hand with the remaining Saxons. The pathway down to the beach was littered with the dead, and we stepped over them as we made our way down it. We hit the Saxon wall and started to kill. I think even at that point the Saxons knew they were beaten, but fair play to them, they fought on. We hacked, we slashed, and we stabbed. I heard one of the men to my right scream and turned to see his sword arm drop to the sand, his sword still gripped in his hand. A huge Saxon warrior on a warhorse was wielding a longsword with practiced ease. He chopped down into the shield of another of my men and it shattered. His second swing of the blade left a furrow in the man's forehead. I ran at the horse, but he saw me and swung his huge sword at me. It took a chunk of my shield and missed my eyes by an inch. I rolled in the sand and stood just behind him and hacked at the horse's hind legs. It dropped to the sand and the Saxon fell with it. He was back up in seconds. The horse lay dying in the sand and the Saxon growled at me. "That was my best horse, you Viking dog," he screamed. He swung his sword with menace. He took 2 paces toward me, his long sword sweeping in an arc. His sword was twice the length of mine and it would be hard to get past that defense. I stepped back and he stepped closer. I danced to my left and he swung. This time wildly, I ran forward and slashed at his arm before he could swing his big heavy blade back to defend himself. Blood oozed from the cut. "You Viking bastard!" he shouted as he swung at me again. I dropped and rolled across the sand. His blade whistled over my head. I was up and charged at him. I shoulder barged him and he staggered. I slashed and my blade cut into his thigh. Again he swung at me and I stepped backwards. I knew if he hit me with that huge sword this fight would be over. He swung again and I ran at him, stepped inside his defense and punched him in the face. I felt his nose break and he grunted. I stepped back and slashed at him, missed and slashed again. This time I hit the flesh of his upper arm. He swung his blade in a wide arc and my sword caught his wrist. His blade dropped and my steel took his throat. I saw blood oozing from it as he lay on his back on the sand. 2 Saxons ran screaming at me. One stopped suddenly, an arrow in his chest. I glanced behind me, saw Jarun already loading another shaft onto his bow. The other Saxon was not a warrior. His attack was feeble and ill-timed. I sliced his throat with ease. Blood sprayed from the wound as he cried out in pain. I heard cheering and looked up from the dead Saxon. The beach was a mass of dead and dying from both sides. I saw that the Saxons, well, what was left of them, were running. There looked to be less than 50 of them. We let them go. The battle had taken its toll on us all. I sat on the beach, surrounded by what was left of my little warband. We sat on the beach and listened to the dying and wounded men. Every muscle in my body was aching. Jarun sat next to me, his right hand wrapped in cloth as his fingers bled. Osgood plonked himself down and exhaled.
"That was fucking tough," he said as he tossed his battered shield to one side.
I saw Cleng walking toward me, his face a mask of blood. He dropped to the sand. I saw that he had a cut that went from the corner of his mouth to the side of his eye. Blood was oozing out of it. "Well, Uthred, we won," he said as he cut some cloth from his tunic and held it to his face. "Yes, we did, my friend. But at what cost?" I replied. Later that day I walked around the beach. I saw men I had known and counted as friends that had been killed in the battle. Both sides lost good men that day. I watched as 8 men held Cleng down as another used a hot sword to cauterize his wound. The smell of burning flesh stung my eyes. His screams stung my ears. There were too many dead bodies to bury, and I was sure some of the wounded would not last a day or more. We made camp. Fires soon had food cooking. We slept that night and no guards were posted. We felt no need. We were sure the Saxons would not have the nerve to attack again. The following day we awoke to bright sun high in the sky. We looted the dead of both sides. Arm rings were chopped off. Coins looted and weapons were taken. Around midday I called for the men to board the ships. We had arrived on the little island with just over 300 men, and we let with less than 200. 300 Vikings against a mighty Saxon army of over 1,200, and we had won. The journey home took 4 days and we landed just after midday. Rosie and Matilda met me on the beach and were happy to see me. Many women and children left the beach that day, not as happy as their menfolk did not return. I gave the Celts the option to leave us and go home. Each was given gold coins, and they decided to stay with use. It was good to have archers, I thought. I gave Jarun 2 armbands, and he went off to find his father. We talked of the great battle for many evenings. Well into the winter, when our boats had been pulled up, the beach tales of the battle echoed around campfires. I spent the winter training an army of lads. Jarun taught them how to use the bow. Osgood taught them swordcraft, and I taught them tactics. Rosie and Matilda both presented me with children that winter. A boy who was named Uthredson, and girl I called Lucille. The harsh northern winter kept us in our village and kept the Saxons at bay. It was the next spring before I saw Cleng again. He sailed into the little natural harbour one cold spring morning, and jumped from the prow of his ship. We embraced, and he punched me hard on the arm. "So, Uthred, you survived the long winter," he said as I led him to the feasting hall. Servants laid out beer and food for us. "Yes, Cleng," I said. "So, what brings you here?" I watched as his finger traced the deep red scar that cut across his cheek. Have you heard of the Kingdom of Cornwall?" he asked. I nodded. "There are churches full of gold to be had there, Uthred," he said as he chewed on a chicken leg. "Your uncle gave me a ship and its crew for my reward for the battle," he told me proudly. "And," I said, ripping bread from a loaf, "and I think that between us we can go and take some of that gold." He laughed. After the excitement of the battle against Lord Aldwyn and his Saxon army, life in the village seemed to have left me with a hollow feeling inside. I called for the slaves to fetch Osgood, Jarun and Gudver, and we laid out our plans for our trip to Cornwall. Perhaps one day I will share that tale with you. Our victory on the beach at the village of Aldwinton became legendary. Poets wrote about it, minstrels sang about it. Wherever we went, we heard talk of it. Even 20 years later, when Cleng and I were visiting a tavern in London, we overheard a drunken Viking tell the landlord and his cronies about how he had led the archers at the Battle of Aldwinton. The man was found later that evening with his throat slashed, dead in the alley behind the tavern.